A Critical Evaluation of Gonzaloism. 2023.
Note from Audiobook Maker. This document has a lot of long and valuable footnotes which we sadly cannot include here.
In recent years, struggle between different trends within the international communist movement, ICM, has intensified. In particular, the debate on Gonzaloism has taken something of a center stage, as numerous parties and organizations have put out statements with a variety of different evaluations of Gonzalo and his theoretical contributions to Marxism. In previous issues of Red Pages, we discussed some of these matters, including a comprehensive breakdown of why protracted people's war is not a universal strategy for revolution, and commentary on the debate between the Communist Party of Brazil, Red Fraction, CPB-RF, and the Communist-Maoist Party of Afghanistan, CEMPA, on the evaluation of Gonzaloism. Recently, the CPB and the Communist Party of Peru, PCP, have published a joint statement summing up what they see as Gonzalo's major contributions to Marxism. These groups and others have also recently formed a new international communist organization, the International Communist League, ICL, which is composed mostly, but not exclusively, of Gonzaloite organizations. In their founding statement, the ICL upholds many central tenets of Gonzaloism, including the so-called universality of people's war. They also claim that Gonzalo defined Maoism in a complete and scientific way. The ICL is now presenting itself as the center of the ICM and aims to unify all Maoist parties and organizations under its banner and program, while demanding that those who join submit to democratic centralist control by the ICL. The basis of unity of this organization follows the theoretical outlines of Gonzaloism, a doctrine that leading Maoist parties internationally do not uphold. In this article, we break down and critique the main features of Gonzaloism theoretically and historically in order to advance clarity on the question. We hope that this analysis will help to expose the deceitful maneuver the ICL is attempting, distorting the proud example of Maoist revolutionary struggle, past and present, and covering over the substance of our movement with crude slogans and half-truths. The CPB, one of the leading organizations in the ICL, claims that those who do not uphold Gonzalo thought, what they call Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, principally Maoism aka MLM-PM, are revisionists. For example, in their document Lenin and the Militarized Communist Party, the CPB makes the following claim.
The essence of the new revisionism in the question of the party and the line of construction consists in the denial of the necessity of militarization of the communist parties and the concentric construction of the three instruments. By denying the concentric character of its construction, one denies the absolute leadership of the Communist Party over the two other fundamental instruments of the revolution, turning into bourgeois military line, SIC, and consequently denying the construction of the new power through the People's War, as well as denying imperative need of the dictatorship of the proletariat, concealed in their formulas of solid nuclei with much elasticity and multi-party competition. In the processes of constitution and reconstitution of communist parties in the world, the militarization and concentric construction of the three instruments is a determining factor that sets the basis for the great leap of initiating the People's War, a matter of great importance in the experience of the world proletarian revolution.
While they correctly identify Avakianism, solid nuclei with much elasticity, and Prachanda path, multi-party competition, as forms of revisionism, the rest of this articulation indicates that the Gonzaloists believe that every party which does not uphold the militarization of communist parties and concentric construction of the three instruments is, in fact, promoting a new form of revisionism. As if this were not enough, they make it clear these two approaches are the determining factor, SIC, which sets the basis for starting a people's war and even forming a communist party in the first place. All of this is confusing, even downright absurd, as the two parties leading the biggest people's wars in the world at present, the Communist Party of the Philippines, CPP, and the Communist Party of India, Maoist, CPI, Maoist, do not uphold the lines of concentric circles of party building and militarizing the party. So from the CPB's formulation, it follows that these parties are not Maoist, but actually revisionist. These parties are not actually waging people's wars, as they did not do the basic things needed to set the basis for launching a people's war. That is to say, they did not militarize their parties, nor do they practice the concentric construction of the three instruments. It is only when these parties uphold the necessity of militarization of the communist parties and the concentric construction of the three instruments that they will stop being revisionist and constitute or reconstitute genuine communist parties. The CPB and associated Gonzaloid parties have put out various solidarity statements and efforts for the CPP and CPI, Maoist, and yet, at the same time, their analysis of what revisionism is implies that these two leading parties are, in fact, revisionist. Though the CPB stops short of stating this directly, it is the logical implication of their political line. This is concerning, particularly at a time when they are positioning themselves as something of an international center within their recently formed ICL. While things have not yet come to a head, there is a need for comrades in the U.S. and internationally to take stock of these developments and learn from this important debate. Given that a constellation of organizations have unified under one banner and are arguing that it was Gonzalo and the PCP who defined Maoism in a complete and scientific way, there is an urgent need for a sober evaluation of Gonzalo and the PCP's theoretical and practical contributions to the ICM. This is especially important because many positions put forward by Gonzalo and the PCP are in direct opposition to those promoted by Marx, Lenin, and Mao. The ICL is wrong to claim that Gonzalo defined Maoism in a complete and scientific way. In fact, despite struggling against forms of revisionism in Peru and internationally, Gonzalo also revised and therefore negated key lessons of MLM in the name of supposedly synthesizing Maoism. In order to see this clearly, one must understand basic lessons of MLM, in particular the history of the Russian and Chinese revolutions. Generally, the Gonzalites today are deeply ignorant and confused on these matters. What little they understand is often regurgitated in an extremely formulaic fashion, mechanically grafted onto a different situation or selectively quoted to justify a fundamentally different Gonzaloite conclusion than the lessons of the class struggle summed up by Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao. So, when they claim that Gonzalo played a key role in creating what they often refer to as MLM, principally Maoism, whether they use the word synthesized or defined, they only reveal their own disagreements with the basic principles of MLM. Here we aim to provide an overview and critique of the central tenets of Gonzaloism as an ideology, in the form that it was promoted by the PCP after 1988, and explain how these related to a series of significant mistakes made by the PCP during the course of the People's War. In particular, we analyze the PCP's 1988 general political line to show how, at least by that time, Gonzalo and the PCP had abandoned MLM in favor of a form of revisionist politics, with a distinct similarity to Lin Biaoism. This is part of the larger necessary effort in the ICM to sum up the successes and failures of the PCP and the theoretical contributions and mistakes of Gonzalo. We hope that this effort enriches the present debate within the ICM over these important questions. A few introductory remarks. This document is not and cannot be a comprehensive summation of the successes and failures of the PCP. We are aware of some efforts to take steps in this direction, Doubtless there are others of which we are unaware. We look forward to reading and critically engaging with these as they are published. At present, however, some of the most prominent voices from Peru in the ICM promote an extremely reductive and dogmatic analysis of the history of the PCP. These accounts generally refuse to critically assess the leadership of Gonzalo and tend to echo various mechanical and even quasi-religious slogans from the PCP in the period from 1980 to 1992 to justify such an approach. The extreme belligerence with which such forces treat any critical reflection on the history of the PCP and Gonzalo's leadership constitutes a significant barrier to clarity within the ICM on the real history of the class struggle in Peru. What's more, this narrow and vociferous dogmatism, which at times goes so far as to insist that not only did the PCP never make any mistakes, but also that they represent the apex of revolutionary theory and practice, plays into the hands of various anti-communist forces who seek to wholesale discredit the heroic struggles of the Peruvian people under the leadership of the PCP during the People's War. When various bourgeois and anti-communist commentators are the only ones critiquing various shortcomings of the PCP, albeit often in an exaggerated fashion, aimed at entirely discrediting the revolutionary struggle, a significant portion of people will be at least partially convinced by these narratives. This will be the case also as long as genuine communist forces are unable to provide a sufficiently clear and objective materialist analysis of the revolutionary struggles in Peru under Gonzalo's leadership. Our hope is that, despite our own limitations, we can contribute in a modest way to this effort of providing an objective and materialist analysis. This task is not easy, and it is made harder by the extreme dearth of publicly available documents from the PCP during the People's War. For example, the 3 volumes of the collected works of the Communist Party of Peru, which span the years 1968 and 1992, are missing numerous documents from this crucial period. Even some documents written by Gonzalo and the PCP, which were published in the Revolutionary Internationalist Movement's RIM publication. A World to Win are not included in these collected works. Since A World to Win is publicly available online, examining these documents is not a problem. However, we have been unable to find copies of numerous other documents that we know were written. For example, the collected works does not contain a single document from the years 1983 or 1984, 2 key years in the armed struggle. It is also missing all the documents from the party's pivotal Second National Conference in 1982. Numerous other important documents, such as Gonzalo's military thought of the party and Great Plan to conquer bases, are also not included, and we have been unable to find copies of them elsewhere. Likewise, we found no copies, electronic or physical, of the PCP's theoretical journal Nueva Democracia. Lack of access to key documents necessarily makes it impossible for us to provide an overall analysis of the successes and failures of the PCP during this period, or a comprehensive analysis of the development of their political line. Despite these difficulties, in this document, we aim to critically analyze some of the main tenets of Gonzaloism, especially as synthesized in the PCP's 1988 First Party Congress, and published in their general political line from that year, demonstrate conclusively that they are in contradiction to lessons of the Chinese and Russian revolutions, as well the lessons of the Paris Commune and revolutions of 1848, and thereby show that concerning the PCP's synthesis, what was good was not new, and was new was not good. Although the lack of access to key materials means there will doubtless be shortcomings in our analysis, we nevertheless must make an effort to analyze and criticize the key tenets of Gonzaloism, given the negative role that the Gonzalites play at present in the ICM today. All of this being said, it is important to note that the leaders of the PCP did not start off promoting revisionist and eclectic ideas. In the 1960s and 1970s, Gonzalo and others waged a successful struggle to break from revisionism in the old PCP and set out on a new and revolutionary path. They were inspired by the Chinese Revolution and the Cultural Revolution in particular, as well as the work of José Carlos Mariátegui, the founder of the PCP in 1928, who took important first steps in applying Marxism to Peruvian conditions. They worked to launch the armed struggle and broke from various incorrect ideas and trends that existed in the communist movement in Peru at the time. This was a heroic and revolutionary effort, and at this point, the PCP was a genuine Marxist organization with some significant but secondary confusions and shortcomings. That a Marxist party or organization would have such confusions and shortcomings at this stage of development is not surprising or unique. For example, in the 1960s in India, Charu Majumdar led the efforts to break from the revisionist Communist Party of India, Marxist, and set out on the revolutionary path. This led to the Naxalbari revolt in 1967 and subsequent uprisings in thousands of villages across India in the next few years. Charu and his comrades were real Marxist revolutionaries, but also had some key confusions. In his famous 8 documents, Charu promoted a number of incorrect lines, including opposing the need for mass organizations, promoting the slogan,
Chairman Mao is our chairman,
and arguing that
he who has not dipped his hands in the blood of the class enemies can hardly be called a communist.
every party needs its own chairperson. The chair of the party in China could not be the chair of an Indian party. Likewise, not all struggle is violent in nature, and many communists are not directly involved in revolutionary violence, even though such violence is necessary to overthrow the ruling class. Likewise, in order to lead a successful revolution, communist parties must create and support the development of various mass organizations, which, while under the ideological leadership of the party, are independent organizations with their own internal democracy. Difficulties that flowed from these mistaken lines led to serious setbacks in the movement in India. However, the comrades in India were able to sum up these mistakes, engage in serious self-criticism over them, and chart a new course forward. This allowed the Naxalites to stay on the revolutionary road, overcome these setbacks, and eventually form the Communist Party of India, Maoist, in 2004. Revolutionary organizations are divided by the two-line struggle, and thus, alongside the possibility of rectifying errors, there is the possibility for a genuine Communist Party to consolidate around negative ideas and conclusions. Unfortunately, in Peru, the PCP was unable to sum up their mistakes, or even recognize many of them as mistakes. Throughout the course of the armed struggle, they doubled down on many of their incorrect positions. By at least 1988, these incorrect ideas had become dominant in the party. They were synthesized in the PCP's general political line and explicitly promoted as Gonzalo thought. This no doubt contributed to the party's setbacks, including the capture of Gonzalo and much of the Central Committee in 1992, and the defeats the revolutionary movement suffered over the next few years. Contemporary Gonzalote groups, especially the CPB and many of their allied parties in the ICL, promote Gonzaloism as Maoism. Therefore, it is necessary to deal specifically with the politics eventually promoted by the PCP itself, and expose in detail how the views they promoted in the general political line are fundamentally revisions of the essential lessons and verdicts of MLM, which amount to a significant left deviation in line with many of Lin Biao's views. These views include a commandist approach to leadership, which is incompatible with democratic centralism, despite the PCP's claims to uphold democratic centralism, a form of religious a priorism based around the claim that Gonzalo personally guaranteed the victory of the revolution and would guide the people all the way to communism. a promotion of a bourgeois view of socialism in line with Trotsky's fantasies of militarizing society, and more. At the same time, it would be incorrect to deny the successes of the PCP or their contributions to the ICM. However, a sober analysis is needed to properly sum up the theory of Gonzalo thought and its differences with MLM, especially at a time when Gonzaloite parties and organizations are claiming that only those who uphold their warped interpretation of Maoism are free from revisionism. In this document, we will go through a number of the revisionist and left deviationist views promoted by the PCP in their general political line, and contrast those with the lessons of MLM. We also include various examples of mistakes made by the PCP, and provide some analysis of how these mistakes relate to some of the central revisionist tenets of Gonzaloism. We begin with a brief overview of some of the shortcomings of the PCP's class analysis of Peru, in particular, their limited analysis of the various contradictory class forces among the peasantry, and their related ultra-left approach to intermediate forces. These shortcomings contributed to their eventual defeat. From there, we dive into more of the central theoretical tenets of Gonzaloism, beginning with the concentric circles approach to party building. We contrast this with the approach taken in China and Russia, explain how the Gonzaloist view is tied to the idealist policy of Jefatura and the supposed absolute leadership of the party over the United Front, and show how these views led to setbacks in Peru. In particular, we show how their articulations of absolute leadership reflect an idealist fantasy of eliminating class contradictions in the United Front because of the supposed correctness of leadership. We also explain how this idealism pushed middle forces into the arms of reaction. In this section, we also discuss the idealist a priorisms promoted by the PCP, including the absurd claim that Gonzalo personally guaranteed not only the victory of the revolution in Peru, but also would carry them all the way to communism. We note the parallels between such grandiose proclamations and Lin Biao's reactionary genius theory, as well as Dühring's idealism. We then analyze the three main justifications the PCP provides in their general political line for why all communist parties must militarize and what exactly they meant by militarization of the party. Justifications which reveal the PCP's deep infatuation with violence as the key link at all times, a sentiment typical among petty bourgeois revolutionary romantics, but antithetical to MLM. We show, in detail, how their emphasis on the party being militarized under socialism, supposedly because this is the only way to prevent counter-revolution, is based on the absurd idea that the principal task of the party under socialism is to carry out military-type actions, and the related delusion that violence is the key for eliminating the vestiges of exploitation which remain under socialism. We contrast this with the approach taken in the USSR and China during the socialist periods. We also note the parallels between the Gonzaloist dreams of a global people's war and Trotsky's permanent revolution. The Trotskyism of the PCP does not end there. We also demonstrate how their views of socialism as a militarized society and their promotion of the policy of war communism are basically a replica of the positions which Trotsky and Bukharin promoted at the end of the Russian Civil War, and which were strongly opposed by Lenin and Stalin. The core of what is promoted as the PCP's and Gonzalo's synthesis of Maoism in their 1988 general political line reflects a profound lack of historical knowledge about the basic practices and lessons of the Chinese and Russian revolutions, as well as the great proletarian cultural revolution. All of this is a tremendous step backwards compared to the clarity achieved in China and in the leading revolutionary movements in the contemporary era. To this day, Gonzaloite ideology continues to exert a negative influence on the ICM, and now Gonzaloites are working overtime to claim the mantle of Maoism and form a new communist international, the ICL. Therefore, it is time for genuine Maoist forces to struggle against this malformed ideology and to expose the rotten bourgeois core that is contained in many of their positions. A few notes on the PCP's class analysis and their underestimation of the enemy. The PCP's general political line suffers from a number of glaring issues. While claiming to uphold Maoism, and while offering some correct criticism of the Soviet and Chinese revisionists, the document is not a work of Maoism. Instead, it synthesizes various Lin-Biaoist and Trotskyist positions into a left deviation. This is perhaps most evident in the reductive class analysis of Peruvian society put forward in it. While there are some basic and correct conclusions about Peruvian society's class character, e.g., that it is semi-feudal and semi-colonial, this is not the same as a comprehensive class analysis. The limitations of the PCP's basic understanding of Peruvian society can be seen, for example, in the fact that they do not distinguish between different strata of the peasantry beyond poor, middle, and rich. In fact, the middle peasants are only mentioned twice in the general political line, and agricultural laborers are not mentioned at all, limitations which are typical of the document as a whole, especially in a country in which the majority of the population is living in the countryside. Understanding the complexities of class contradictions and various levels of stratification between different sections of the peasantry, including how these vary in different locations, is of central importance in developing a correct political line. The PCP completely failed to do this. Overall, the PCP's class analysis amounted to ignorance of the basic class realities in the countryside and in Peruvian society at large. In order to develop a correct line, a party must have an objective analysis of the fundamental class dynamics in the country. This requires more than just simply noting the existence of various classes. Instead, the party must make a detailed analysis of the complex and contradictory class forces at play and how they vary regionally. In practice, the PCP's reductive class analysis led to various difficulties. For example, their failure to win over the middle peasantry to consistently support the revolution due to their ultra-left focus on the poor peasants. It's not that the poor peasants aren't a key force in the revolution, they are, but that the question of how to unite them with other progressive classes is key to developing a correct line and charting a course forward for the revolution. The PCP failed to address this task in their general political line. In his critique of Soviet economics, Mao noted that, in the USSR, there were various confusions on the nature of the middle peasantry and various types of stratification in this class. He also spelled out the issues that inevitably arise from an oversimplified understanding of the middle peasants.
The book, 1961-1962 edition of the Soviet text Political Economy, makes no analysis of the middle peasant. We distinguish between upper and lower middle peasants, and further between old and new within those categories, regarding the new as slightly preferable. Experience in campaign after campaign has shown that the poor peasant, the new lower middle peasant, and the old lower middle peasant have a comparatively good political attitude. They are the ones who embrace the people's communes. Among the upper middle peasants and the prosperous middle peasants, there is a group that supports the communes, as well as one that opposes them. According to materials from Hubei province, the total number of production teams there comes to more than 40,000, 50% of which embrace the communes without reservation, 35% of which basically accept them but with objections or doubts on particular questions, 15% of which oppose or have serious reservations about the communes. The opposition of this last group is due to the fact that the leadership of the teams fell to prosperous middle peasants or even undesirable elements. During this process of education in the struggle between the two roads, if the debate is to develop among these teams, their leadership will have to change. Clearly, then, the analysis of the middle peasant must be pursued, for the matter of whose hands hold rural leadership has tremendous bearing on the direction of developments there.
Mao's comments are instructive, and they also help to clarify a distinct weakness in the PCP's political line as it was synthesized in 1988. Without a clear class analysis of various contradictions among the peasantry, and in particular within the middle peasantry, it is impossible to maintain rural leadership and continue a revolutionary direction of development. This confusion on basic aspects of Peruvian society, a result in part of ignorance of or disagreement with the basic approach to class analysis promoted by Mao, clearly contributed to the eventual setbacks the PCP faced in many rural areas in the late 1980s and early 1990s, which in turn led them to retreat forward to the cities. During this period, a significant section of the peasantry, in particular the middle peasantry, in the party's guerrilla zones and support bases, began to rally behind the landlords, rich peasantry, and state-sponsored efforts to oppose the PCP. Rondas campesinas, armed peasant patrols sponsored by the military and under the leadership of the landlords and rich peasantry, proliferated across the countryside and closely collaborated with the armed forces in the fight against the PCP. By 1990, rondas had been formed in over 3,500 villages in the departments of Ayacucho, Apurimac, Huancavelica, and Junin, including in many in areas that had formerly been strongholds of the PCP. The fact that a section of the peasantry would collaborate with the state and armed forces is not a surprise, nor is it necessarily an indication of mistakes on the party's part. However, the rapid proliferation of the rondas in the late 1980s and early 1990s, especially in areas where the party had been organizing for years, indicated that serious errors had been made on the PCP's part. By 1990, thousands of villages in these departments had formed rondas, which put the PCP on the back foot in rural areas and forced them to retreat from their former strongholds. While coercion was used by the ruling class in the formation of some of these rondas, there was also clearly a real base of support for them among the peasantry. The PCP's inability to defeat this campaign of mobilizing the rondas should be contrasted with the success of CPI, Maoist, in defeating the state-sponsored Salwa Judum campaign, where numerous adivasis were conscripted as special police officers, SPOs. While some declassed and lumpen elements did readily cooperate with the paramilitary forces, the state was not able to cultivate a mass base to oppose the revolutionary struggle, and in a few short years, the party was able to defeat Salwa Judum. Part of the reason for the PCP's inability to overcome this campaign was that they fundamentally misunderstood the basic strategy employed by the ruling class during this period, and therefore strategically underestimated the forces of reaction. For example, Gonzalo and the PCP repeatedly refer to the armed forces as experts at defeat, noting the inability of the armed forces to crush the revolution during its 1983-1984 offensive. During this offensive by the ruling classes, despite making various mistakes, the PCP had been able to beat back the armed forces and withstand the unprecedented repression they faced. In the context of the military's wholesale slaughter and repression of the masses, the PCP was able to win over many middle-of-the-road forces. However, they made a serious error in assuming that the armed forces and the ruling class more broadly would not learn from their mistakes and adjust the strategy and tactics of their counter-revolutionary offensives. These assumptions were related to various idealist formulations promoted by the party, including that they were condemned to win. For example, they stated, "But hasn't our party taught us that we are condemned to win? A beautiful verdict. This is more valid today than yesterday, and tomorrow it will be even more so." The idea that forces of reaction were incapable of learning from their mistakes and formulating new strategies to defeat the people's war was codified in the PCP's general political line. The reactionaries dream about elaborating superior strategies to people's war, but are condemned to failure since they are against history. Our People's War, after nearly 8 years, blazes victoriously, demonstrating the invincibility of People's War. The idea that the reactionaries could not defeat the People's War because they are against history is an idealist distortion of basic reality. Various people's wars around the world were defeated in the 20th century. To argue that an abstract force of history guarantees the victory of a given revolutionary struggle is an abandonment of materialist principles. It is an idealist fantasy of an external force supposedly determining the course of events. The correctness of the political line of the Communist Party leading a given revolution is the only thing that can guarantee its victory. There must always be two-line struggle internal to the party, to that it stays on the revolutionary road and that its line does not degenerate into opportunism and adventurism or even revisionism. These sort of idealist formulations are commonplace in the PCP's documents, and by at least 1988 they were not a secondary trend, but the cornerstone of the PCP's line. We analyze some of the fundamentally idealist tenets at the heart of Gonzaloism in the second and third sections of this document. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, the reactionary armed forces, while continuing to carry out various massacres and brutal oppression, changed their general strategy for counter-revolution. They abandoned the prior policy of blanket repression of the masses and large-scale forced relocations of the peasantry into concentration camps, and instead focused on cultivating the rondas and other counter-revolutionary forces at the village level, working in close collaboration with the rich peasantry, landlords, and other local reactionary elements. They focused on the various grievances the peasantry had with mistakes the PCP had made. In particular, the ways in which various ultra-left policies, including cutting off the peasants from rural markets, which we discuss more below, had hurt the middle peasantry. This strategy allowed the forces of reaction to rally the middle peasants and even some of the poor peasants under the leadership of the rich peasantry. Thus, the armed forces not only had taken stock of some of the reason why they failed in the 1983-84 campaign, but also had an understanding of some of the PCP's mistakes and shortcomings. In particular, they were aware of the ways in which PCP's faulty class analysis of Peruvian society had led them to alienate significant sections of the peasants. The PCP failed to take stock of this changed strategy of the armed forces and continued to insist that the army was pursuing a policy of steal everything, burn everything, and kill everybody. This quote is a reference by the PCP to the policy of burn all, kill all, and loot all, eventually adopted by the Japanese fascists during their invasion and occupation of China. While there were some similarities between this policy and that of the Peruvian armed forces in this period, the truth is that the basic strategy the military pursued was quite different. However, the idealist beliefs of the PCP prevented them from taking stock of this and realizing the success the ruling class was having in eroding their mass base. For example, as late as 1990, the PCP insisted that the armed forces were pursuing the same strategy as in the past.
Again today, they resurrect the same treacherous lie, trying to undermine the People's War and cover up the forceful nucleation they inflict upon the peasantry to create mesnadas, paramilitary peasants, repeating obsolete molds previously smashed by the convergence of the enslaved masses themselves and by guerrilla actions. It is evident that with the increasing revival of mesnadas created by the armed forces, which we saw more frequently these past few months, their aim is to reenact the genocidal bloodbath of the years 83 and 84.
This and other statements by the PCP indicate that the party's evaluation was that the rondas were largely being defeated and that the army would soon be forced to return to more extreme forms of overt repression and wholesale slaughter. Only in 1991 did the PCP begin to realize the scope and scale of the success the ruling classes were having in mobilizing the peasantry against the revolution. The ability of the ruling classes to carry out such a large-scale, counter-revolutionary mobilization of the peasants, under the leadership of the landlords and rich peasantry, speaks to the significance and scope of the mistakes the PCP was making at the time. Relations between the party and the peasantry had been damaged to such a degree that a significant portion of the middle peasants and even poor peasants and agricultural laborers rallied behind the leadership of the landlords and rich peasantry against the party. These mistakes included the large-scale closing of rural markets and fairs, part of efforts by the PCP to cut off the supply of goods from the countryside to the city. The party hoped that this policy would help to exacerbate the growing crisis in the cities, deprive them of food and other necessary agricultural products, and thereby prepare more favorable circumstances of seizing control of the cities and combating the government's counter-revolutionary offensive. However, this approach reflected deep confusions about basic political economy and revolutionary strategy. The peasantry are highly dependent on the flow of finished goods from the cities to meet their basic economic needs. Without tools, clothes, medicine, and other essentials, the peasants will experience a precipitous drop in their standard of living, as well as their level of production. This is what happened in many villages in Peru, and it severely damaged relations between the party and the masses. The PCP understood clearly that the peasants' demand for land was central to the revolutionary struggle, but they struggled to continue the revolutionary transformation of the relations of production beyond smashing the semi-feudal ownership of large-scale landholders and some related successes, bringing cattle rustlers and other lumpen elements to justice. They did carry out some forms of collective and cooperative agriculture, but failed to grasp basic elements of political economy. In particular, the key role of rural markets in allowing the peasants to sell surplus agricultural products and purchase key finished goods. Their approach of stopping the peasants from selling their surplus in the markets also alienated elements of the national bourgeoisie, and is part of the reason that the PCP was unable, even in the midst of a major revolutionary crisis, to win the support of any significant section of this class. In contrast to this approach, the CPI, Maoist, has fought against efforts by the Indian state to close various fairs and markets in their guerrilla zones and base areas. As the party's former General Secretary Ganapathy noted,
"We give scope to small and medium bourgeoisie to grow with some restrictions so that they may not become anti-people, and black marketing, stockpiling and speculating can be controlled. We only restrict big capital, the comprador bureaucratic bourgeoisie and foreign. For instance, in 1988 to 1999, the government had stopped small traders to deal in forest products. So as the Kirjas, local traders, protested, we fought for them in a movement, though we stopped usury and have controlled indiscriminate exploitation. We are not stopping products from outside to come in. This is capitalist development of one kind, but we are controlling it. It is needed to develop the people's economy. If traders did not cooperate, how would we have survived? Under the Janatana Sarkar, Revolutionary People's Government, the Trade and Industry Department is handling the small traders so that the bourgeois outside cannot take advantage.
and
If we can completely and correctly utilize the situation where people are taking their destiny into their own hands and can formulate and implement, even if at a basic level at present, a plan which coordinates needs, production, consumption, market and capital, then we will be able to take a leap in the economic sphere. This leap would definitely consolidate the people's political power. For area-wise seizure of power, and for carrying on people's war, such efforts in the economic sphere are very much necessary. Mobilizing people politically into the economic affairs and enhancing their participation and active role would be decisive.
These remarks help to clarify the basics of a Maoist line on the matter in question. They reflect an understanding of the lessons of the Chinese Revolution, where the CCP fought hard against Chiang Kai-shek's economic blockade of their base areas. Ganapathy's comments highlight the complex and interrelated tasks facing a revolutionary party in the economic sphere during a PPW. These tasks are not reducible to smashing semi-feudal property relations. These mistakes were not properly analyzed and corrected, and instead the party doubled down on them. This line was years in the making, but it was eventually systematized in the PCP's 1988 General Political Line. And it is this and other backward lines the PCP promoted, and contemporary Gonzaloites continue to promote, as both a synthesis of Maoism and its extension and application to Peru, termed Gonzalo thought. The PCP's extremely limited class analysis of the peasantry is not unique, but typical of their overall surface-level understanding of Peruvian society. In General Political Line and other documents from this period, there is no analysis of the lumpen proletariat, despite the significant presence of narco-traffickers in many regions in which the PCP was active, and the huge urban slums around Lima and other cities. While these slums contained many members of the working class, there was also a significant presence of declassed and antisocial elements, but the party failed to provide any analysis of these forces in the general political line. Likewise, there is no discussion of the various indigenous groups in Peru. In the 1960s, the PCP drew on Mariátegui's analysis of the Indian question from the 1920s, but did not further expand upon it or take stock of various developments since that time. In their general political line, the only mention of this question is the statement that the People's War is the solution to the land question, the national question, and the question of the destruction of the landlord bureaucratic state and the reactionary armed forces. Of course, a thoroughgoing social and political revolution under proletarian leadership is the only true solution to the myriad of issues the masses face under the present system. However, as they say, the devil is in the details. Without a correct political line on how to handle various contradictions, including the national question, it is impossible to lead a successful revolution. These are just a few further examples of the flawed class analysis put forward by the PCP in their general political line. There are many others. These mistaken understandings of the basic class realities in Peru had significant practical consequences and contributed to the defeat of the revolution. The class analysis put forward by the PCP in this document is no model to follow. It should be a teacher only by negative example. It was ultimately a dogmatic caricature of a Maoist class analysis, heads spinning in concentric circles. As we noted above, the Gonzalites today, following in the footsteps of the PCP, and perhaps in their minds, improving upon or even synthesizing Gonzaloism, put forward a series of articulations about the construction of the party and the supposed need to militarize communist parties. Given that the CPB and others insist that these questions form the dividing line between Maoism and revisionism, these formulations provide a good starting point for an examination of the basic politics of Gonzaloism, as synthesized in the general political line, and how it differs from Maoism. The logic behind their assertions is quite circular. But first, we will follow them around in circles to see that, in fact, this approach to politics goes nowhere. Concentric circles are circles inside of one another, as opposed to, say, a Venn diagram of partially overlapping circles. In the PCP's view, this is the model. Great leadership, aka Jefatura, at the center of everything. The party is then the central circle. Around it is the army, with every member of the party also being part of the army, and then the united front. The CPB provides contrasting images in their document. Lenin and the militarized Communist Party, which are illustrative. It should be noted that the CCP's approach, apparently revisionist, was in line with the image on the left in figure X, as was the Bolsheviks.
Note from Audiobook Maker, the figure can be found in the document on the MCU website.
The basic idea inherent to this Gonzaloist approach to party building is that the party has absolute leadership over everything. This is supposedly secured by having every party member be part of the army and by an undefined, great leadership. Below, we will examine the concrete content of this idea of Jefatura and explain first and foremost why it is pure subjective fantasy to believe that the party can have absolute leadership over the united front, and second, why this is a revisionist fantasy born of petty bourgeois impetuosity, which significantly contributed to the liquidation of proletarian politics in Peru. Before getting into the specifics of these points, it is important to note, and this should be obvious to anyone familiar with Maoism and the history of the Chinese Revolution, that the idea of a militarized party and concentric circles of the party, People's Army, and United Front are not in line with the basic strategy advocated by Mao, nor with the practice of the CCP and People's Liberation Army in China. This should, at the very least, give the Gonzaloites pause in declaring themselves Maoists, but these and other contradictions are instead dismissed with various forms of hand-waving, logical leaps, wordplay, and ritual incantations. After all, according to our Gonzalites, Mao did not synthesize Maoism, so he could not really have grasped the supposed universality of the military strategy of the proletariat, aka PPW, nor the Maoist approach to party building. We needed to wait for Gonzalo to accomplish this glorious task. If these mental gymnastics have the reader's head spinning, we must apologize. In order to understand the basic politics put forward by the CPB and other Gonzaloites, we will have to travel deep into the maze of their circular logic. A task which can be dizzying but is necessary to expose the revisionist essence of their basic views. It is absurd to argue that, in order to be a Maoist, one must abandon the basic principles of revolutionary struggle promoted by Marx, Lenin, and Mao. Of course, the particularities of different countries requires that tactics and strategy vary accordingly. But adjusting tactics and strategy in line with particular conditions is different than adopting a fundamentally different approach to basic organizational questions and principles, especially those concerning the organization of a party of professional revolutionaries. All of this also pertains to the questions of party discipline, the mass line method of leadership, the contradiction between leadership and the LED, and much more. As we will see, by advocating for the absolute leadership of the party, built around the supposed great leadership of one person, over the united front, the Gonzaloites are promoting a form of one-man leadership which is quite different than the political and ideological centralization which is central to MLM. This amounts to advocating for a negation of hard-won lessons of the class struggle which were synthesized by Marx, Lenin, and Mao. This is really what is at stake in the debate around Gonzaloism. What are the fundamental principles of Maoism? Because the claims of the Gonzalites are so surreal and absurd, it's worth reiterating that according to their parties and organizations, the fundamental principles of Maoism with respect to party organization and basically everything else are not those spelled out and summed up by Mao, but instead Maoism is actually composed of completely different principles, many of which directly contradict Mao and the CCP's views. summed up by Gonzalo and the PCP in the 1980s. Absolute leadership, idealism, and class contradictions. As we noted, the theory of concentric circles is inextricably tied up with the PCP's insistence on the absolute leadership of the party over the United Front. In the first issue of Red Pages, we criticized this Gonzalite idea, which was put forward in a May Day statement by the CPB and others. As we noted at the time, the All-Country United Front is a broad organization of all classes which have an interest in the revolution. In semi-feudal countries, this includes the rich, middle, and poor peasantry, the working class, the petty bourgeoisie, and the national bourgeoisie. In the countrywide United Front, it is impossible for a communist party to exercise absolute leadership, nor is it possible to organize a united front with military discipline. Instead, the party must struggle with a variety of class forces to promote proletarian leadership within the United Front. This is why, in describing the United Front, Lenin wrote that
only those who are not sure of themselves can fear to enter into temporary alliances, even with unreliable people. Not a single political party could exist without such alliances.
in this case, Lenin was referring to the alliance of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party made with the Russian so-called legal Marxists, who were really bourgeois Democrats that used Marxist terminology. This particular United Front effort helped to popularize Marxist literature in Russia and was crucial to exposing the Narodniks, a petty bourgeois, left-adventurist tendency in Russia. This was important as it helped to clarify the significance and importance of Marxism to the masses of people, and the role that Marxism could play in guiding the Russian revolutionary movement. During this temporary alliance, the party did not occupy a position of absolute leadership. Therefore, as the situation shifted, the Tsarist censor began to ban Marxist literature, and the legal Marxists adopted a more conciliatory approach to the Tsar. This temporary alliance was dissolved. Based on Lenin's analysis of the situation in Russia, he and others were aware that a temporary alliance with bourgeois Democrats was possible and advantageous for the party's work at that time. However, had they tried to impose the party's absolute leadership over the legal Marxists, such an alliance would not have been possible in the first place. This united front was a struggle front in which the party had to fight to ensure that revolutionary politics stayed in command, and when that was no longer the case, they broke off their alliance with the legal Marxists. Another historical example of importance is the Second United Front between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese nationalists. This united front was only possible in the first place because Mao and the CCP were able to split the nationalist camp, including through convincing nationalist general Zhang Xueliang to help them kidnap Chiang Kai-shek during the Xi'an incident in December 1936. Even after this, the CCP made a whole series of concessions to preserve the United Front, including renaming the Red Army and nominally subordinating themselves to the leadership of the Kuomintang. Even these measures did not prevent the nationalist troops from attacking the CCP at Chiang's directive during the 1941 New Fourth Army incident. Despite this attack and other aggression from the nationalists, the CCP was able to preserve the United Front and avoid fighting both the nationalists and the Japanese at the same time. This would have been impossible if they had held illusions about the need for the party to exercise absolute leadership over the United Front. However, the authors of the May Day statement and the adherents of Gonzalo thought more broadly struggle to grasp this essential lesson. Instead, based on a reductive understandings of leadership, in particular, an exaggeration of the role of individual leaders. They promote the revisionist notion that from the supposed absolute correctness of the individual leader follows the absolute leadership of the party over the United Front. This ultimately leads to the party abandoning the need to concentrate and synthesize the correct ideas of the masses. By arguing for the absolute leadership of the party over the United Front, the PCP not only contradicts the lessons of Maoism and promotes a commandist approach to mass organization in which the role of the masses is principally to listen up to the supposedly correct leadership, but also reveals a deep commitment to an idealist understanding of class contradictions. No party can eliminate the existence of class contradictions, and therefore contending class forces, in the United Front, not to mention the army and even the party itself. These class contradictions will not disappear until the arrival of communism. The question is how to correctly handle them. No amount of hand-waving can do away with this basic objective reality, which is a result of the class society in which we live. A basic lesson of Maoism is that even after a successful revolution, the existence of class contradictions and class struggle will continue to exert a powerful influence in society. In order to overcome these contradictions and continue on to communism, parties must analyze them and work out a line to resolve them. Fantasies of absolute leadership negate materialist analysis of class society and replace it with a form of magical thinking, expressing an underlying belief that class contradictions can be eliminated immediately. Unfortunately, by the time of the publication of their general political line, the PCP had consolidated around idealist views on these topics and made these views a centerpiece of their practical efforts. In practice, the concentric circles approach to party building and related idealist fantasies of absolute leadership over the United Front led to significant problems in the PCP's United Front work, especially ultra-left and commandist tendencies. Early on, the party had some significant success uniting with broad popular opposition to new repressive government measures, despite various shortcomings in the PCP's line. For example, in 1981, shortly after the launch of the PPW, the Belaunde government passed a new anti-terrorism law known as Legislative Decree 046, which gave broad sweeping powers to the government to crack down on popular struggles, including the ability to imprison people and journalists for up to 5 years if they publicly defend an act of terrorism. Broad sections of the people, including the peasantry, progressive intellectuals, trade union leaders, Catholic priests, and even revisionist parties mobilized against this law, worried that it was a step back towards the military dictatorship which had officially ended in 1980. The PCP did not create this broad popular opposition, but it was able to engage with the movement to oppose the law, help win freedom for some political prisoners, and garner support for the armed struggle, which was still at a low level at this time. They were helped in their efforts by the fact that most of the electoral left parties and progressive intellectuals thought that the PCP's attacks on power stations, electrical towers, and other such infrastructure were actually being carried out by right-wing paramilitary forces as a false flag operation to justify new repressive laws. Thus, while the PCP was able to take advantage of this relatively favorable situation, it was not predominantly because of popular support for their sabotage efforts. One example of the PCP's early successes in United Front efforts can be seen with campaign to free Edmundo Cox Beuzeville, a cadre in the party who was captured by police in the Cusco department on May 26, 1981. After being severely tortured, he admitted to being a PCP member and revealed the location of a cache of dynamite. A video of his confession was leaked to the press and aired on TV in Lima. His appearance revealed clear signs of extreme torture. This elicited a large popular outcry, and even the Catholic Church's Episcopal Commission of Social Action released a statement in his defense, demanding that the government guarantee the physical and moral integrity of the individuals detained. Due to this and other related efforts, Cox was eventually released, and later went on to play a major role in the party's Metropolitan Committee, which led their activities in Lima. Similar efforts were made to free PCP cadre and supporters who were arrested in this period all around the country. In April 1981, 3 people accused of belonging to the PCP and dynamiting a TV transmitter were arrested in the remote department of Puno. Various religious leaders, many of whom were sympathetic to liberation theology, as well as trade unions and the parliamentary left, which had significant leadership over the peasant organizations there and had recently won mayorship of the province, mobilized for the release of those imprisoned and were able to get 2 of the 3 people freed. These early successes working with other organizations in a broad united front show the relative clarity that the PCP had at the time. They were able to take advantage of available openings to free cadre, engage with popular opposition to new repressive laws, and more. However, by 1988, the PCP had consolidated to the view that the party had to have absolute leadership over the United Front, and explicitly identified the United Front with the construction of the new state. In fact, in Section 5 of the General Political Line, titled Line of Construction of the 3 Instruments, the United Front is no longer mentioned as one of these instruments. Instead, it is replaced by the new state, showing how the PCP directly equated the two. The view that the United Front is reducible to the new state that the PCP was building in its base areas is in direct contradiction with the experiences and lessons of the Chinese Revolution. For example, during the Second United Front, with the Kuomintang, GMD, Mao and the CCP entered into a tactical united front with the Chinese nationalists and led the countrywide movement to resist the Japanese invasion. That is, they were tactically united in the need to resist the Japanese invasion. But strategically, the CCP and GMD had very different objectives and goals for the future of China. While the CCP was building a new state power in the countryside, they did not limit the United Front to these efforts alone. And, after the defeat of the Japanese fascist forces, it became necessary to fight a civil war against the GMD and renew the agrarian revolution. However, in this period they were able to, in part because of their tactical united front, build and lead a countrywide strategic united front for the new democratic revolution. This sophisticated and subtle approach to the United Front was based on a materialist analysis of the class contradictions in Chinese society and an understanding of the need to unite with a variety of unreliable and unstable allies. This was not limited to the GMD, but also included a whole series of different forces including intellectuals, reformists, bourgeois democrats, and patriotic landlords. The party was willing to work with them even if they were not under the party's direct leadership, and even if they were not part of the new state that the CCP was building in the countryside. This is in direct contradiction to the PCP's approach. If the CCP had argued that the United Front was reducible to the new state, their tactical alliance with the GMD against the Japanese invaders would never have been possible. Instead, they would have been forced to fight against both reactionary forces at the same time, and the victory of the revolution would have been jeopardized. To better understand the Maoist approach to the United Front, it can be helpful to refer to Ganapathy's remarks on the topic.
For broadest possible unity, we cannot have sectarian approach towards friends of the new democratic revolution. At present, several forces are lined up against the enemy. We have to let them develop too. In the United Front on some issues, there would also be representatives of oppressive classes. We cannot expect them to join our ranks, which is a long way ahead. Right now, we need to firmly stick to our strategic goal, and for that, tactically, we need to remain flexible. More clearly, there are 2 different kinds of united fronts. One between people and the other between people and enemy, a section or group, persons from enemy classes, using the contradictions among the enemy. The party has to do that. This scope is there to some extent on some issues. We call it the indirect reserves of the revolution, which can be used carefully. If we have clear understanding that they are not our class allies, then we would not have right opportunist deviations. We need united fronts of this kind for the success of the revolution. The Indian left, largely like the Communist Party of India and the Communist Party Marxist, had trailed behind the bourgeoisie and degenerated. Last aspect is that each class has a separate class interest and a worldview. The United Front in this sense is also a struggle front. But overall, if the struggle is against the main enemy, then this struggle, internal to the United Front, becomes secondary, while unity becomes primary. The real issue is how this struggle and unity can be balanced and used effectively. The enemy classes will never side with the people. Even after the seizure of power, struggle will continue within the society for a long time. So, United Front and class struggles should continue simultaneously. For that, it is an utmost important task to concentrate on the ideological and political education of the masses. If we can do this successfully, then we can win over those sections too and allow them to join our ranks. These parties also have people under a corrupt leadership. If we can win over the people through political and ideological struggle, we can win over a large number of their primary membership. The revolutionary breakthrough is linked to this process. The Chinese and Nepalese party have developed through leaps and bounds by doing the same. Both the cadre force as well as the army can expand through this politically and ideologically also. If this dialectical relationship between the United Front and the political and ideological struggle can be handled carefully, we will succeed in forming a strong United Front and isolate the main enemy.
Early on, the PCP adopted something fairly similar to this approach. However, by 1988, they had a narrow and sectarian understanding of the United Front, reflecting their fantasies of absolute leadership. Some practical examples can help to clarify this point. In 1987 in Puno, where 6 years earlier the PCP successfully helped forge a broad united front against new repressive laws, the party began to carry out selective annihilations, assassinations, of many of the parliamentary left leaders in the region, and even went so far as to assassinate numerous peasant and teachers' union leaders. For example, in April 1987, they entered the town of San Juan de Salinas, captured the parliamentary left mayor Zenobio Huarsaya, and put him on trial. Despite popular opposition to killing him, the PCP went forward with his execution anyways, based on the justification that he was an enemy of the people, because he was an elected official in the reactionary state. This was part of the PCP's strategy to create a power vacuum by assassinating various mayors and elected officials. To justify these attacks, they argued that hitting or beheading state authorities or bureaucrats of whatever level hampers the running of the state and, even more, generates a power vacuum. In justifying such assassination against Huarsaya and other members of the parliamentary left, the PCP argued that, although having the complexion and appearance of humble peasants, served the exploiters and betray their class. They did it in the times of the conquest, and they do it now in the Republic. Huarsaya was part of a petty bourgeois pseudo-Marxist party, the Partido Unificado Mariateguista, PUM. However, just a few years earlier he had been sympathetic to the PCP and involved in a number of campaigns to support the release of captured cadres and supporters. The assassination of Huarsaya and others, as well as attacks on the PM's reformist agricultural initiatives, created a good deal of popular outrage in Puno and around the country against the PCP. This was exacerbated by the PCP blowing up various PUM and church-run buildings used by peasant organizations in Puno for their meetings. Many members of the masses who had formerly been sympathetic to the revolution became outraged. In Puno, the PUM was not a marginal organization. Under their previous name, Vanguardia Revolucionaria, VR, they had been a major component of the Confederación Campesina del Perú, a peasant organization which led land seizures in the 1970s in Puno and elsewhere, and which had around 250,000 members by 1978. They had also led department-wide general strikes under the military dictatorship and afterwards. The PUM was also one of the leading forces in the Federación de Campesinos del Puno, FDCP, which led a massive seizure of 340,000 hectares of land from the state-sponsored semi-feudal cooperative farms, which were largely a reorganization of the old feudal estates along semi-capitalist lines. They enjoyed significant support from progressive intellectuals and from the liberation theology-inclined priests and bishops in the region. Actually, the PUM as whole was somewhat sympathetic to the PCP. They had formed as a new party in 1984 and argued that there was a need to unleash a war after constructing a series of mass organizations. They rejected the approaches of other parties in the parliamentary left, who had given up on the need for armed struggle. Overall, they had something of a petty bourgeois radical approach and were not consolidated to parliamentary cretinism. That being said, given the PUM's politics, they were not able to win lasting victories for the masses, as their efforts constantly floundered on reformist and liberal illusions about the state. However, they enjoyed significant mass support among the peasantry, working class, and petty bourgeoisie in the region. It was not easy to quickly change this and reveal to the masses the limitations of PUM's political orientation. What's more, given the sharp conflict between PUM and the central government, it may have been possible for the PCP to engage in a tactical united front with them and work together to oppose the central government's refusal to fulfill its promises to distribute land to the peasantry. This, in turn, could have helped to win PUM's continued opposition to the deployment of the military to Puno against the PCP. In such a united front, the PCP would have been able to struggle with the PUM for leadership of the peasant organizations and other mass organizations as well. Or, if this was not possible, the PCP could have, at the very least, exploited the contradictions between PUM and the central government. Either way, as Ganapathy notes in the above quote, it is necessary to win over the masses who are following the backwards leadership of various corrupt and opportunist parties. However, after being unable to quickly wrest leadership of the peasant struggle from PUM, despite PUM's numerous limitations and backwards politics, the PCP resorted to selective annihilations of PUM politicians and leaders, as well as leaders of mass organizations aligned with PUM. This approach not only foreclosed on any sort of united front with PUM, it also isolated the PCP from significant sections of the masses, especially the peasantry in Puno. It reflected an extreme impetuosity, seeking to short-circuit the necessary struggles to demonstrate to the masses, in practice, the limitations of PUM and other revisionist parties. In short, the PCP's narrow understanding of the United Front and their fantasies of absolute leadership led them to liquidate organizing efforts, push PUM closer to the central government, and alienate themselves from large sections of the peasantry and progressive petty bourgeoisie. The extremely backwards approach the PCP took in this situation can be further elucidated by examining the contradictions internal to the PUM at the time, which was divided between two major factors, the Libios and the Zorros. The former, representing the majority of the party, was fairly sympathetic to the PCP and argued that the PUM should take up the armed struggle in the short term. The latter was more conservative and argued that the PCP was a regressive force. In their Second National Congress in July 1988, the Libios won the majority in the party. The Zorros split and left, and the PUM began preparations to start their own armed struggle, which they would abortively try to launch first in 1989 and then again in 1990. Both efforts failed to get off the ground. However, by 1991, the PCP's continued assassinations of PUM members and various leaders of their associated mass organizations led to another split in the party, this time between those who wanted to solely rely on the rondas to oppose the PCP and those who wanted to also collaborate with the military. By that point, the PUM had consolidated to strongly opposing to the PCP. The question was just over how best to do so. The point of this exposition is not to claim that the PUM was a thoroughly revolutionary force. They clearly were not. But they can be understood as something vaguely akin to the socialist revolutionaries, SRs, in Russia. There were serious divisions between the right and left wings of the party, and the left wing was fairly sympathetic to the PCP. Had the PCP not pursued such a narrow and sectarian approach to the United Front, it would have been possible to win over significant sections of the PUM to support the People's War and to wrest from them the leadership of various mass struggles, much like the Bolsheviks did with the socialist revolutionaries. However, Gonzalo had declared the PUM to be enemies of the revolution and did not differentiate between different contradictory tendencies internal to the organization. To clarify the extremely backwards nature of the PCP's approach, it can be helpful to contrast it with the policy pursued by the Bolsheviks, to expose the limitations of the Menshevik and socialist revolutionary leadership after the February Revolution. In June 1917, when the first All-Russia Congress of the Soviets was held, the Bolsheviks were a relatively small minority. Only 105 of the 1,090 delegates were Bolsheviks. But by the time of the Second All-Russia Congress of the Soviets in October, the Bolsheviks had a majority. They did not accomplish this by assassinating Menshevik and SR leaders or deputies and Soviet delegates, often trade union and peasant leaders, who sided with these other parties. Instead, the Bolsheviks organized tirelessly in the factory committees, among the soldiers, and with the peasants to expose the bankruptcy of these petty bourgeois parties, including especially their willingness to resume Russia's participation in the imperialist war. Thus, without carrying out any selective annihilations of these opportunists and revisionists in this period, the Bolsheviks were able to lead a successful revolution. What's more, they were able to split the left SRs off from their party and win their support at a crucial moment in the revolution. In contrast, the PCP's actions led to their rapid isolation from a significant section of the masses. Support for forming rondas to drive out the PCP grew among the peasantry, and likewise among the PUM and various liberal forces in the church. By the time of Fujimori's coup in 1992, the parliamentary left in Puno had grown so antagonistic to the PCP that they did not even issue a statement of opposition to the coup. On the one hand, this shows the political bankruptcy and feebleness of these parliamentary forces at this time. However, it also shows the way in which the PCP's line of absolute leadership of the United Front pushed wavering forces into the arms of reaction. Ultimately, the PCP was unable to utilize the basic contradictions between different sections of the ruling class, the petty bourgeoisie and electoral parties, and use these contradictions to form different united fronts. Jefatura, metaphysical guarantees, and idealist a priorism. In Peru, these idealist fantasies of absolute leadership were tied to extremely backwards ideas, like that Gonzalo was the guarantee of the triumph of the revolution who will carry us to communism, the promotion of party members swearing loyalty oaths to Gonzalo, and articulations of the Central Committee's conscious and unconditional subjection to the sole leadership of Chairman Gonzalo. Such articulations go beyond reductive class analysis and idealist fantasies. They veer into the territory of religious thinking. This sort of thinking, unfortunately, is the heart and soul of Jefatura and the concentric circles approach to party building. The idea that Gonzalo's Jefatura was the guarantor of victory is a form of idealist a priorism, which the party took up in the place of revolutionary Marxism. Enshrining these a priorisms in the party's general political line speaks to how the party had consolidated to revisionist ideas by 1988. No individual's leadership can guarantee the victory of a revolution. To assert otherwise is Düring-esque. It is akin to Düring's self-aggrandizing proclamations of his individual genius being free from any subjectively limited conception of the world, and his related claims of having discovered a final and ultimate truth. The parallels are further elucidated by the PCP's messianic claims that not only does Gonzalo guarantee the victory of the revolution, but that he will also carry us to communism. This is a negation of the dialectical, materialist theory of knowledge, substituting for it a form of deeply religious idealism that disarms the masses of people. Practical experience has shown the incorrectness of this line, but it was clear before Gonzalo's capture that these assertions contradicted foundational principles of dialectical materialism. Promoting these formulations contributed to the growth of various non-proletarian class tendencies in the party and in the revolutionary movement, especially bourgeois commandism. These issues were particularly evident in the way in which, after Gonzalo's capture in 1992, the revolution went into an acute retreat and was largely defeated by 2000, if not before. In On Practice, Mao emphasizes the central role of social practice in verifying the correctness of knowledge.
Marxists hold that man's social practice alone is the criterion of the truth of his knowledge of the external world. What actually happens is that man's knowledge is verified only when he achieves the anticipated results in the process of social practice, material production, class struggle, or scientific experiment. If a man wants to succeed in his work, that is, to achieve the anticipated results, he must bring his ideas into correspondence with the laws of the objective, external world. If they do not correspond, he will fail in his practice. After he fails, he draws his lessons, corrects his ideas to make them correspond to the laws of the external world, and can thus turn failure into success. This is what is meant by failure is the mother of success, and a fall into the pit, a gain in your wit.
The PCP's sloganeering about Gonzalo guaranteeing their victory negates the Marxist theory of knowledge. Even before the setbacks in Peru, it should have been clear that claiming that an individual would guarantee victory was deeply backwards. Such claims are not only extremely individualistic, but also reek of formalism and a petty bourgeois desire for guarantees of correctness or victory. They also put a major damper on internal line struggle. Such sloganeering is antithetical to MLM and stands in sharp contrast to the approach promoted by Mao and the CCP. Instead of religious proclamations about the metaphysical power of a leader guaranteeing victory, the CCP relied on a clear understanding of the relationship between democratic centralism and collective leadership. This was spelled out in a basic understanding of the Communist Party of China. The strengthening of collective leadership is an important precondition for the implementation of democratic centralism in the party, an important guarantee for the establishment of the party's centralized leadership. The party committees at all levels are bodies which exercise centralized leadership. However, party leadership is a collective leadership and does not come from the arbitrary decisions of particular individuals. It is only by conscientiously implementing the system of collective leadership that we can correctly practice democratic centralism in the party, and that the committees of the party can fully play their role as nuclei of leadership in correctly carrying out all tasks. In general, there is a limit to how well a single individual can think about a question and analyze it, so that when decisions on important questions are made by one individual, it is difficult for him not to be subjective and one-sided. Only if we practice collective leadership, if the members of the party committee reflect the opinions of the party members and the masses in all their aspects, If they study and discuss questions from every point of view and in depth, will we be able to concentrate the wisdom of the masses to arrive at correct ideas, make decisions that conform to objective reality, and avoid or diminish the risk of error? At the same time, this enables the leading members of the party organizations to learn from each other and to move forward together. The idea that Gonzalo personally guaranteed victory undermined the system of collective leadership in the PCP. It promoted subjectivism in their ranks and inhibited proper functioning of democratic centralism. What sort of inter-party democracy can exist if a leader is declared to be absolutely correct and to be the individual who personally guarantees not only the victory of the revolution, but the transformation of all human society to communism? This view is idealism, pure and simple. Each individual has subjective limitations. We all have a mix of correct and incorrect ideas. In Anti-Düring, Engels ridiculed Düring for the claim that his philosophy was free from any subjectively limited conception of the world. Yet with Gonzalo and the PCP, we find that they have discarded Engels and taken up Düring. True, this form of a priorism is cloaked in a new garb and prettified with new phrases, but its idealist essence is one and the same as the pitiful philosophy of Herr Düring. It has just as little value for the proletarian cause. This religious form of devotion to Gonzalo, which the PCP promoted, was extremely detrimental to the struggle. In the wake of Gonzalo's capture, the CC doubled down on this devotional tendency, stating, "The Central Committee of the PCP reaffirms itself in its plain, conscious, and unconditional subjection to the sole leadership of Chairman Gonzalo and to the entire system of party leadership. No party member should place themselves under the unconditional subjection of any person, nor should any organ of the party. Following the leadership of any individual and the party is conditional, namely on whether or not they are promoting a proletarian line on a given topic and overall. If a key leader in a party does adopt a non-proletarian line, then this must be struggled against. If the party overall takes up such a stand, this must be opposed. If there is still a practice of democratic centralism in the party in question, then it can be possible for those holding minority opinions to do so within the party, even as it maintains unity of action. Then the correctness or incorrectness of a given approach gain be clarified through struggle and practice over time. Likewise, if a key party leader is making some key but secondary mistakes, and this is not uncommon, then this can be struggled against in the spirit of unity, struggle, unity. If Gonzalo guaranteed the party's victory, how could and why should any party member oppose anything he put forward? Doing so would, according to this view, be opposing the guarantee that the revolution is bound to succeed, and may as well be opposing the revolution itself. In contrast to this approach, it can be helpful to refer to Mao's views on democratic centralism in the party.
Without democracy, there cannot be any correct centralism, because people's ideas differ, and if their understanding of things lacks unity, then centralism cannot be established. What is centralism? First of all, it is a centralization of correct ideas, on the basis of which unity of understanding, policy, planning, command, and action are achieved. This is called centralized unification. If people still do not understand problems, if they have ideas but have not expressed them, or are angry but still have not vented their anger, how can centralized unification be established? If there is no democracy, we cannot possibly summarize experience correctly. If there is no democracy, if ideas are not coming from the masses, it is impossible to establish a good line, good general and specific policies and methods. Our leading organs merely play the role of a processing plant in the establishment of a good line and good general and specific policies and methods. Everyone knows that if a factory has no raw material, it cannot do any processing. If the raw material is not adequate in quantity and quality, it cannot produce good finished products. Without democracy, you have no understanding of what is happening down below. The situation will be unclear. You will be unable to collect sufficient opinions from all sides. There can be no communication between top and bottom. Top-level organs of leadership will depend on one-sided and incorrect material to decide issues. Thus, you will find it difficult to avoid being subjectivist. It will be impossible to achieve unity of understanding and unity of action, and impossible to achieve true centralism. Is not the main item for discussion at this session of our conference opposition to dispersionism and the strengthening of centralized unification? If we fail to promote democracy in full measure, then will this centralism and this unification be true or false? Will it be real or empty? Will it be correct or incorrect? Of course it must be false, empty, and incorrect. Our centralism is built on democratic foundations. Proletarian centralism is based on broad democratic foundations. The party committee at various levels is the organ which implements centralized leadership. But the leadership of the party committees is a collective leadership. Matters cannot be decided arbitrarily by the first secretary alone. Within party committees, democratic centralism should be the sole mode of operation. The relationship between the first secretary and the other secretaries and committee members is one of the minority obeying the majority. For example, in the Standing Committee and the Political Bureau, situations like this often arise. When I say something, no matter whether it is correct or incorrect, provided that everyone disagrees with me, I will accede to their point of view because they are the majority. I am told that the situation exists within some provincial party committees, district party committees, and county party committees, whereby in all matters whatever the first secretary says goes. This is quite wrong. It is nonsense if whatever one person says goes. I am referring to important matters, not to the routine work which comes in the wake of decisions. All important matters must be discussed collectively. Different opinions must be listened to seriously, and the complexities of the situation and partial opinions must be analyzed. Account must be taken of various possibilities and estimates made of the various aspects of a situation, which are good, which bad, which easy, which difficult, which possible, and which impossible. Every effort must be made to be both cautious and thorough. Otherwise, you have one-man tyranny. Such first secretaries should be called tyrants, and not squad leaders of democratic centralism.
In contrast to the PCP's idealist fantasy that Gonzalo's leadership was an a priori guarantee of victory, Mao emphasized the importance of democratic centralism in the party. He noted that he regularly acceded to the majority view while in the minority, and contrasted this with the situation in some party committees where whatever the first secretary says goes. He described the latter situation as quite wrong, and noted that it was nonsense if whatever one person says goes. And yet this was ultimately the view that the PCP enshrined in their general political line. By promoting these sorts of idealist fantasies about Gonzalo, the PCP ended up practicing a form of one-man leadership, somewhat akin to Lin Biao's genius theory instead of democratic centralism. Mao's self-evaluation and the PCP's Lin Biaoism. The PCP's grandiose proclamations about Gonzalo, which were endorsed and promoted by Gonzalo himself, should be contrasted with Mao's humble and dialectical analysis of his own strengths and weaknesses. One of the best examples of this is in his July 1966 letter to Jiang Qing at the start of the GPCR. In this letter, he offers many poignant remarks, including spelling out his concerns about Lin Biao's promotion of idealist views about Mao. Although it is cumbersome to include such a long quote, it is necessary to quote extensively from this document.
I have never believed that those booklets, quotations from Chairman Mao of mine, have that sort of magical power. Now if he praises to the sky, the whole party and country do so too. It is like Wang Po selling melons, selling them and praising them. I have been forced by them to ascend Liang Mountain. It seems it won't do to disagree with them. To agree with others on big questions, despite my inclinations. This is the first time in my life I have done so. This is what is called something that is not determined by human will. Ruanji of the Jin dynasty objected to Liu Bang. He, Ruan, went from Luoyang to Chenggang and proclaimed the lack of heroes in the world allows those without ability to gain fame. Lu Xun once said the same thing about his own essays. I am of the same mind as Lu Xun. I like that sort of frankness of his. He said he would dissect himself more severely than when dissecting others. After having taken several spills, I also tend to do as he did, but comrades generally don't believe in doing so. I am confident, but also have a certain lack of confidence. In my youth, I once said that I believed I would live 200 years and ride the waves for 3,000 li. I seem to be quite arrogant, but I doubt myself and overall believe that, like in a mountain without tigers, the monkey is called a king, and I also became this sort of king. But this contradictory assessment is not a form of eclecticism. I have something of a tiger's nature. This is primary. I also have something of a monkey's nature, second in importance to that. I once brought forward the several lines Li Gu of the late Han Dynasty, 221-206 BC, wrote to Huang Qiong, "What is tall is easily broken. What is pure is easily stained. Those who are able to perform the white snow in spring are quite few in number. When one is famous, it is difficult to match one's reputation." The last two phrases really refer to me. I once read these lines at one of the meetings of the Standing Committee of the Politburo. It is important to know oneself. In April of this year, at the Hangzhou conference, I expressed my difference with that sort of pronouncement of Lin Biao's. But what was the use? When he went to Beijing at the May conference of 1966, he still spoke that way, and the press even more fiercely so, simply exaggerating to the point of fantasy. As such, I could only ascend Liang Mountain. I guess their real intention is to use a zhongqi to attack ghosts. I truly have served as the Communist Party's zhongqi in the 60s of the 20th century. Objects all must go towards their opposite side. The more the praise, the heavier the fall. I am preparing to fall and be broken to pieces. That is no worry. Matter cannot be destroyed, but it is shattered into pieces. The whole world has over 100 communist parties. Most of the parties don't believe in Marxism-Leninism. These people have also beaten Marx and Lenin into pieces, so what of us? I urge you to pay attention to this question. Do not become dizzy in your head from victory. Frequently think of your weaknesses, shortcomings, and mistakes. I have talked with you about this question so many times that I don't know the count. You do still remember that in April, in Shanghai, this was discussed as well. The above writing often has what approaches black words. Do not some anti-party elements speak in just this sort of way? But they want to completely defeat our party and myself. I am but speaking in regard to my own role, about which I think there are a few formulations that are not reasonable. This is the difference between me and the Black Gang. This matter cannot be made public at present. The entire left and the broad masses all are speaking in this way. Making it public would pour cold water on them and help the right, and the present task is for the entire party and country to achieve a general defeat. It cannot be a complete one, of the right, and then in 7 or 8 years to have another movement for sweeping away the monsters and demons, and after their will for more sweeping. Therefore, these nearly black words of mine cannot be made public now.
Mao's insightful analysis of the political situation in 1966 and his own strengths and weaknesses is of great importance. Of particular relevance is the way in which he opposed the religious idolization of him promoted by Lin Biao. While it was necessary to work closely with Lin Biao in the early GPCR to topple the Liu Deng clique and ensure the support of the PLA for the GPCR, Mao had deep reservations about Lin's approach. Mao was concerned by promoting the cult around him. Lin was actually maneuvering politically for his own gain, a fear which would prove well-founded based on Lin's eventual coup attempt. Mao was also worried about the impact that such idolization had on the party and the masses. In contrast to Mao's concerns about Lin, Gonzalo and the PCP had no such scruples about adopting Lin-Biaoist practices. We can see this, for example, in their repeated promotion of Gonzalo as the greatest living Marxist-Leninist-Maoist. This was not just a phrase that they used after his capture, but was codified in their general political line in 1988. In their 1991 document concerning the two hills, they go so far as to explicitly attribute all of the achievements of the party to Gonzalo and Gonzalo alone. Gone are the masses who make history, and in their place we find Jefatura, which is really just another great man theory of history.
Who has developed Marxism, raising it to levels that you cannot even imagine how much it contributes to the revolutions in the world today? Who has established all those laws of society, of the state, of the party, of the revolution, of the people's war, of the army, and of the new power? Everything has been done by Chairman Gonzalo, the greatest living Marxist-Leninist-Maoist on the face of the earth today. Can anyone prove otherwise?
This is Lin-Biaoism, not Maoism. Mao himself repeatedly opposed Lin and others promoting such hagiography. The PCP seems to largely model itself off of Lin's promotion of the cult of personality around Mao in the early GPCR. Their confusion on this topic does not just stem from a lack of historical knowledge of this period, but also reflects various non-proletarian understandings of leadership in the PCP. In the early months of the GPCR, Mao and the left were forced to be less public with their critiques of Lin's absurd formulations, so as to not pour cold water on the emerging mass enthusiasm. However, after the defeat of the Liu Deng clique, it was possible to wage a more resolute struggle against the cult of personality promoted by Lin and related forms of feudal and bourgeois devotion to Mao's image. While Lin was promoting these practices to further his own agenda, their widespread adoption related to various backwards trends that still existed in Chinese society, including significant vestiges of Confucianism and feudal thinking. As Mao put it when speaking with Edgar Snow in 1971, it was hard for people to overcome the habits of 3,000 years of emperor-worshipping tradition. The struggle against these ideas in the back of people's minds was a central part of the GPCR, which aimed to overcome the Four Alls. This is why, after Lin's failed coup attempt, Mao and others on the left launched the Criticize Lin Biao, Criticize Confucius campaign. Gonzalo and the PCP not only failed to take stock of the important lessons of this struggle in China, they in fact promoted many of the same practices that were struggled against. It is one thing for a party to make some mistakes. This is inevitable to one degree or another. However, it is another thing entirely for a party to codify these mistakes as the cornerstone of their practice and insist that they have universal validity. And now the contemporary Gonzaloites absurdly insist that only those who uphold these Lin Biao-esque formulations are free from revisionism. According to the CPB and others, one must follow Lin Biao's approach and ignore Mao in order to be a Maoist today. What an absolute mess of infantile rubbish! A Chinese Maoist group recently published an excellent document, History Project of the Republic, The History and Logic of Revolution and Restoration, which provides some important insight into Mao's views on formulations, such as claims that he was the greatest living Marxist-Leninist of his time.
In early April 1970, Mao Zedong reviewed the draft of an article written by the editorial board of the two newspapers and one journal of the Central Committee to commemorate the 100th anniversary of Lenin's birth and wrote a large paragraph of criticism. Regarding my words, I have deleted several paragraphs, which were useless and offensive to others. I have said this 100 times, but no one listens to me. I don't know why. Please ask the comrades of the Central Committee to look into it. He deleted from the draft. Chairman Mao is the greatest Marxist-Leninist of our time, raised Marxism-Leninism to a brand new stage. Mao Zedong thought is the Marxism-Leninism of the era when imperialism is heading for total collapse and socialism is heading for worldwide victory. Comrade Mao Zedong is the contemporary Lenin, etc. Before the Cultural Revolution began, Mao accepted Lin Biao's cult of the individual against his will, so as not to dampen the enthusiasm of the revolutionary masses, but now it was time for the cult of the individual to recede. Many people say that Mao's cult of the individual was totally unhistorical, but in fact it was Mao who was correcting the cult of the individual. The cult of the individual actually came from two sources. On the one hand, it is the social change that makes people feel that Mao Zedong is great, but the petty bourgeoisie deified this greatness. On the other hand, it came from Lin Biao's misleading of the revolutionary masses.
Mao was clearly opposed to labeling him the greatest Marxist-Leninist of our time, precisely the way official PCP documents describe Gonzalo. Mao viewed such statements as useless and offensive to others, and yet the PCP promoted them. They likely based themselves on the communique of the 11th plenary session of the 8th Central Committee and other texts which repeat such slogans. But they did not understand, or did not care to understand, that these articulations were promoted by Lin Biao and his clique. They clearly remain ignorant of the crucial lessons of the GPCR, in particular from the Criticize Lin Biao, Criticize Confucius campaign. While there was a great deal of confusion in the ICM post-1976 on the lessons of the GPCR, and therefore various misunderstandings were not uncommon in parties around the world, the depth of the PCP's confusion on democratic centralism and their deep commitment to a Lin Biaoist politics go far beyond basic misunderstandings and reveal a serious deviation in their approach. A militarized new synthesis. In their general political line, the Central Committee of the PCP outlined 12 basic principles of their program. Number 7 is militarization of the party and concentric construction of the three instruments of the revolution. This is no accident. These are inseparably tied together in their line, as we have mentioned above. The idea of militarization of the party, as outlined by the PCP, is not reducible to the fact that the party must prepare for warfare and revolution. It is specifically an articulation of how to organize and structure the party, namely, as a military organization. This is spelled out quite clearly in the GPL and is in line with the basic understanding of what it means to militarize an organization. For example, they state, the militarization of the party can only be carried forward through concrete actions of the class struggle, concrete military-type actions, and that we must carry out mainly these forms so as to provide incentive and development to the class struggle. Teaching with deeds, with these types of actions, as the principal form of struggle in the People's War. They likewise note, the mass work of the party is done through the People's Army, and the masses are mobilized, politicized, organized, and armed as the new power in the countryside and in the People's Defense Revolutionary Movement, MRDP, in the cities. In contrast to this propaganda of the deed approach to revolution, CPI, Maoist cadre, have noted that actually, and here they are following the footsteps of Mao and the Chinese Revolution, around 80% of the work done by the party and the People's Liberation Guerrilla Army, PLGA, is non-military. These including the PLGA engaging in productive activity, e.g., helping to reclaim wasteland, harvesting forest produce, etc., as well as mobilizing the masses, doing educational work, distributing goods to the masses displaced by the counter-revolution, and more. During their trip to Dandakaranya, Gautam Navlakha and John Myrdal were told that without these activities, military action would cease to carry much weight or be able to sustain popular support. Mao, speaking of the Chinese Revolution, likewise noted that while the party did play a leading role, it was against doing everything itself and thus substituting for the masses. Indeed, its concrete practice was to pay call on the poor to learn of their grievances, to identify activist elements, to strike roots and pull things together, to consolidate nuclei, to promote the voicing of grievances, and to organize the class ranks, all for the purpose of unfolding the class struggle. This is a lesson that the PCP did not heed. Their confusion on this topic reflected their naive understanding of the strategy of protracted people's war and was tied to their focus on military-type actions as the key form of activity at all times. The line of militarizing the party in Peru resulted from related confusions and in turn deepened them. In practice, this meant not only overemphasizing the importance of military actions and underemphasizing non-military ones, but also replacing party discipline with military discipline. Maoists. Parties must have party discipline, but this is significantly different from the military discipline of a revolutionary army. And while the PCP claimed to uphold democratic centralism even while militarizing, in fact, the democratic centralism advocated by Mao was quite different than what was preached by the PCP. Both used the same term but meant very different things, as the PCP's promotion of jefatura-related idealistic notions about Gonzalo clearly demonstrate. This is something of a pattern with the Gonzaloites, who use various Marxist terms and concepts but have a fundamentally different understanding of them. For the Gonzaloites, the methods of Mao and the CCP are outdated because a new synthesis of Maoism was made by Gonzalo. In their general political line, the PCP at least has the honesty to admit that this approach of militarizing the party is quite different than what was practiced in Russia and China.
The militarization of the party has its antecedents in Lenin and Chairman Mao, but it is a new problem developed by Chairman Gonzalo taking into account the new circumstance of the class struggle, and we must see that new problems will arise which will be resolved through experience. These will necessarily imply a process of struggle between the old and the new that will develop it further. With war being the highest form of resolving contradictions, of empowering the faculties people have to find solutions. It is the militarization of the party which has enabled us to initiate and develop the People's War. We consider that this experience has universal validity, and for that reason it is a requirement and necessary for the communist parties of the world to militarize themselves.
According to the PCP, the militarization of the party is needed because of the supposedly new circumstance of the class struggle. A key element of this supposedly new circumstance is that they were entering into the times of war, so that all forces should be militarized. However, the CCP and the Bolsheviks both dealt with revolutionary struggles during wartime without militarizing the party. This factor alone is not sufficient to explain why militarization, which constitutes, as the PCP openly acknowledges, a different approach to party organization than that advocated by Lenin and Mao, is needed, in Peru or elsewhere. And the PCP had no qualms about claiming that militarization of the party is a requirement and necessary not only in their own circumstances, but for all the communist parties of the world. One of the PCP's main justifications for militarization is that it is the militarization of the party which enabled us to initiate and develop the People's War. This claim is dubious. Was militarization actually the key link in launching the People's War? Or was it the relative political clarity of the party at the time and the very favorable objective circumstances in Peru? Even if one does believe that militarization was the key link, it is quite something to jump from this to the conclusion that this experience has universal validity, and relatedly that it is a requirement and necessary for the communist parties of the world to militarize themselves. This is not a scientific analysis or approach to summing up experiences. To conclude that the approach of militarization of the party is universal based on the experiences of Peru alone is not the problem, since experiences from one country can have universal validity. But concluding this requires careful consideration and analysis to differentiate between particular and universal. The problem is concluding that the organizational principle of militarization of the party is universally applicable and necessary to initiate a people's war, in spite of the fact that it was not applied by the Bolsheviks, who did not fight a protracted people's war but did lead a successful revolution, or the CCP. Nor was it applied by numerous other parties which successfully launched people's wars, including the CPP, CPI, Maoist, the Vietnamese Communist Party, the TKP-ML, the Nepalese Party, and others. The claim that militarization of the party is needed to start a PPW also flies in the face of basic factual evidence. It smacks of dogmatism and empiricism. Mao noted that dogmatism is divorced from concrete practice, while empiricism mistakes fragmentary experience for universal truth. Clearly, both apply here to the PCP's 1988 document and the CPB's contemporary utterances. It is the height of dogmatism to assert, in the face of basic and obvious practical evidence to the contrary, that militarization is a necessary prerequisite for initiating a people's war. At the same time, it is also extremely empiricist to argue based on a one-sided appraisal of the PCP's own experience that the militarization of the party, concentric circles, and the strategy of PPW are universal truths. The presence of both these deviations in the PCP's basic approach is in line with Lenin's point that dogmatism and empiricism, much like economism and adventurism, are two sides of the same coin. As we noted above, the contemporary adherents of Gonzaloism take all of this a step further and argue that opposing the supposed need to militarize and concentric circles is the essence of new revisionism. In reality, Maoist forces who refuse to uphold the Gonzaloites' absurd approach are not revising MLM, but rather opposing Gonzaloism, which is itself a revision of the basic lessons of MLM. Before breaking down in detail the three other main reasons that the PCP provides for the supposed necessity for communist parties to militarize, it is important to analyze one other issue in the above-quoted paragraph, namely the PCP's claim that war is the highest form of resolving contradictions, of empowering the faculties people have to find solutions. This is not a Maoist line, though it seems to be cherry-picked from a quote from Mao, to give the PCP's dogmatism the form of appearance of Maoism. In Problems of Strategy in China's Revolutionary War, Mao wrote that war is the highest form of struggle for resolving contradictions when they have developed to a certain stage, between classes, nations, states, or political groups, and it has existed ever since the emergence of private property and of classes. Here, Mao is not arguing that war is the highest form of struggle for resolving all contradictions, a fact which is obvious even to a toddler, but that this is the case for a certain specific set of contradictions, and even then only once these contradictions have developed to a certain stage. This is exceedingly basic and speaks to the existence of deep-seated confusions in the PCP. Is war the highest form of struggle for resolving the contradiction between the party and the masses? What about the contradiction between the lack of gasoline in a car and the need to drive to work? What about the contradiction between the relations of production and the productive forces under socialism? The class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie reached its hitherto highest form in the GPCR. While there were episodes of violence during this period, it was generally the right which provoked them. The left, in contrast, advocated that the masses use reason, not violence, in the struggle against the capitalist roaders. Different types of contradictions require different methods for resolving them. In On Contradiction, Mao emphasized that a key feature of dogmatism was the inability to grasp this basic point.
The principle of using different methods to resolve different contradictions is one which Marxist-Leninists must strictly observe. The dogmatists do not observe this principle. They do not understand that conditions differ in different kinds of revolution, and so do not understand that different methods should be used to resolve different contradictions. On the contrary, they invariably adopt what they imagine to be an unalterable formula and arbitrarily apply it everywhere, which only causes setbacks to the revolution or makes a sorry mess of what was originally well done.
Given the PCP's argument that war is the highest form of resolving contradictions, it's clear why they argue that the party should principally carry out military-type actions. If all other means of resolving contradictions are lower and less effective, then the party shouldn't waste its time with them. This is an extremely narrow and dogmatic understanding of revolutionary struggle. At any given moment, the party will have a series of different principal tasks in different situations. For example, it could be the case that in one party committee, some serious study is needed to deepen their theoretical grasp of MLM. Elsewhere, in a village, it could be the case that production is lagging behind because of the prevalence of various feudal superstitions, and so the principal task is to wage a mass educational campaign, and so on. This is all exceedingly basic, provided one has even an elementary grasp of dialectics. However, our Gonzaloites, in a typical petty bourgeois radical fashion, look for sweeping one-size-fits-all solutions to complex problems. Their impetuosity harkens back to those in the Chinese Revolution, who put forward all sorts of fantastical theories. Such an approach promotes reductive thinking about how to handle all the different complex contradictions communist parties are bound to face in the course of revolutionary struggles. Instead, they claim that military-type actions are the key link and the guarantee against revisionism. This is little more than a fantasy. We shall return to this topic later in the document. For now, it should suffice to say that clearly war is not the highest form of resolving all types of contradictions. The belief that war solves everything is a magic bullet approach to politics typical of revisionist groups. It is in line with a petty bourgeois infatuation with violence and impetuosity, which does not have the patience for details, but instead seeks out simplified formulas and slogans. This is, unfortunately, a consistent thread that runs through Gonzaloism. By 1988, it had become an official cornerstone of the PCP's practice. This is the Gonzaloite new synthesis, which has little in common with Maoism beyond some proper names, but does share certain clear parallels with Lin Biaoism. Subjective fantasies and fortune-telling, or concrete analysis of concrete situations. We now come to the meat of the PCP's explanation and justification for why all communist parties must militarize themselves. In the general political line of the Communist Party of Peru and elsewhere, the PCP repeatedly asserted that their experiences of militarizing had universal validity, and that other parties must therefore follow them. As we have already stated, the CPB and other Gonzaloites today argue that those parties which do not agree are revisionists. A basic analysis of the PCP's rationale shows that it was based on an incorrect appraisal of the objective situation internationally, as well as the lessons of MLM and the history of the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and the GPCR. To have some confusions is one thing, but to build a political line on the foundation of these incorrect conclusions cannot but lead to opportunism and ultimately revisionism. All of this raises some serious questions for those who, like the CPB, claim that parties not upholding the PCP's general line are the new revisionists. In the general political line of the Communist Party of Peru, the PCP provides three main reasons for the militarization of the party and the related concentric circles approach to party building. 1. The strategic offensive of the world revolution is at hand. 2. Preventing capitalist restoration is principally a military matter. And 3. Socialist society is a militarized society. We will deal with each one individually. First, they note, Chairman Gonzalo expounded the thesis that the communist parties of the world should militarize themselves for three reasons.
First, because we are in the strategic offensive of the world revolution. We live during the sweeping away of imperialism and reaction from the face of the earth within the next 50 to 100 years. A time marked by violence in which all kinds of wars take place. We see how reaction is militarizing itself more and more. Militarizing the old states, their economies. Developing wars of aggression, trafficking with the struggles of the peoples and aiming toward a world war. But since revolution is the principal tendency in the world, emphasis ours, the task of the communist parties is to uphold revolution shaping the principal form of struggle. People's war to oppose the world counter-revolutionary war with world revolutionary war.
This document was hardly the only time that the PCP made this claim. Similar articulations were made in Gonzalo's 1980 speech, "We are the initiators," at the start of the armed struggle, and were repeated throughout the PCP's existence. For example, in their 1985 statement in the third issue of the Revolutionary Internationalist Movement's RIM magazine, A World to Win, the CC of the PCP stated, "The world situation increasingly reveals the existence of an unevenly developing revolutionary situation, and that the main trend is revolution, because only revolution can resolve the basic problems of the world today." This last statement is particularly absurd because the fact that revolution is the only way to solve the basic problems of the world today in no way proves or even implies that revolution is the main trend in the world at this moment. The PCP's fantasies about this supposed strategic offensive seem to be based on Mao's 1966 assessment that, at that time, revolution was the main trend in the world, and that the situation was quite favorable for revolutionary advances in China and internationally. This was the case in 1966, but it was pure subjective fantasy to argue in 1988 that there was a strategic offensive of the world revolution. As early as 1971, the situation had changed markedly, driving the rationale for China opening to the West in order to buy some breathing room, in particular from Soviet imperialist aggression. Later, post-1976, there was a major downturn in revolutionary struggles around the globe after the coup in China, and capitulation of many parties internationally. By 1988, it was clear that the revolutionary forces globally were quite weak. Especially in the US and other imperialist countries, reaction was quite strong, and there was nothing remotely close to a revolutionary situation. In fact, after the major upsurges in the 1960s and early 1970s, the situation had stabilized and the movements receded in most countries around the world. It was hardly the case that those on the bottom refuse to go on living in the old way, and those on the top can no longer rule in the old way in most countries, despite the PCP's claim to the contrary. In Peru, revolutionary forces were fairly strong, and in Nepal, important advances were being made. But in Turkey, the movement was divided. In India, the Maoist Communist Center of India and People's War Group, which would later merge to form CPI Maoist in 2004, were literally fighting each other. In the Philippines, the CPP was pursuing a policy of premature regularization of their forces, which led to major setbacks. The RCP in the U.S. had degenerated into a revisionist organization, and so on. We dealt with this view of the strategic offensive of world revolution in our document on the debate between the Brazilian Gonzaloist Party and the Afghan Maoist Party. In it, we noted, The PCP claimed that, in the next 50 to 100 years, the domination of imperialism and all exploiters will be swept away, which was based on their view that history cannot go backwards. This mechanical conception of history moving in a linear fashion led them to conclude that world revolutionary struggles were at a high tide, when, objectively, the year 1980 was a low point in world revolutionary struggles. Recent years had seen, among other events, the 1976 counter-revolution in China, the further consolidation of the Vietnamese communists to the Soviet revisionist line, the objective and subjective weakness in India following the setbacks in 1972. In short, the PCP substituted their subjective fantasies for reality. In place of concrete investigations of concrete situations, they upheld one quote by Mao, failed to consider that it was a situation-specific analysis and not a religious revelation, and blindly repeated it without taking into account the larger objective reality. In its most extreme forms, this sort of dogmatism manifested in seemingly arbitrary predictions of the future date of global proletarian victory. For example, they calculated that it will take 200 years to consolidate the proletariat's dictatorship, counting from 1871, when the proletariat first took power in the Paris Commune. Of course, they never shared the math behind such calculations. These sorts of prophetic predictions were repeatedly put forward by the PCP as a justification for their views on the strategic offensive of the world revolution, despite clear evidence contradicting this thesis. They seem to have forgotten the basic point that Marxists are not fortune-tellers. The strategic offensive as abstract generality. Leaving aside the issues with the PCP's analysis of the global situation, it is unclear, even if it was the case that there was a strategic offensive of the world revolution, why this would indicate that militarization of parties was necessary. As such, the PCP's argument that being in the strategic offensive dictates that communist parties must militarize amounts to a flat assertion without justification or evidence. In a typical fashion, the PCP and their contemporary disciples turn the specific concept of the three stages of PPW into an abstract generality, and then apply that to the global situation. In On Protracted War, Mao explains these three stages in terms of a literal war, the Sino-Japanese War. The essential content of this concept is inseparable from the fact that it applies to a specific war, not to a general evaluation of the balance of forces globally between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. In a revolutionary war, various classes are engaged in an armed conflict with each other. While it is possible to speak, in a vague and analogical sense, of the world situation in this way, it confuses more than it clarifies, and in no way is it justified to claim that the general laws of revolutionary warfare apply to the global situation, especially at a time when the proletariat and bourgeoisie are not engaged in a global war. The PCP's insistence on characterizing the global situation this way, a practice frenetically mimicked by CPB and other contemporary Gonzaloists, is tied to their infatuation with violence and their flat analysis that the highest form of resolving all contradictions is warfare. Given these non-proletarian tendencies, they cannot but see every situation in military terms. The reality is that the bourgeoisie globally is divided into different countries and blocs. And as Marx and Engels put it in the Communist Manifesto, the proletariat of each country must, of course, first of all, settle matters with its own bourgeoisie. Even after a successful revolution in one country, it is entirely possible that a socialist country could be at war with one bourgeois bloc internationally, while simultaneously at peace or even in a tactical alliance with another section. For example, the USSR fought on the same side as various imperialist powers in World War II. Likewise, while the proletarian forces of one country can be fighting a war against an imperialist aggressor. Another can conclude a tactical agreement with that same imperialist power, such as was done by China with the U.S., at the same time that the Vietnamese people were fighting their war of liberation against U.S. imperialism and its domestic reactionary allies. This tactical agreement did not stop China from continuing to support the Vietnamese Revolution. This is all in line with the basic internationalist policy of a socialist state that Mao and others in the CCP outline in their polemics against Khrushchev and the Soviet revisionists. All of this speaks to the need to be rigorous and scientific with concepts. Concepts have both general and particular content, but they are also only applicable within certain bounds. To insist on sloppiness with such details as a hallmark of political practice leads to all sorts of confusion. For example, Marx made extensive use of biological analogies in Capital. He spoke of metabolism, fermentation, etc. These analogies are helpful. They clarify many concepts to the reader. But Marx was always clear these were analogies. He never once tried to argue that, based on his use of these analogies, we should apply biological methods to understand political economy. To double-think around the basic evidence that the proletarian forces are, in fact, very weak globally right now relative to the bourgeoisie, the CPB claims that we are in the defensive phase of the strategic offensive. We leave it as an exercise for the reader to figure out what could possibly be meant by this genius turn of phrase. This sloppiness, which conflates analogies with concepts, and the PCP's related dogmatism, is tied up with their claim in the general political line that there is a need to develop a world revolutionary war to counter the forces of reaction and developments towards World War III. This is another version of the worldwide people's war, which the PCP also promoted, and which we also criticized in our above-mentioned document on the debate between the Afghan and Brazilian parties. To jump from this analogy to the idea of a global people's war is a major leap. It is not a Maoist position, but a Trotskyist one. It resembles Trotsky's idea of permanent revolution and his insistence that, after the October Revolution, the Red Army should have invaded Germany to export the revolution. The PCP's Worldwide People's War thesis negates the need for socialism in one country and the central importance of the class struggle under socialism, replacing it with a quick victory through military action, largely in line with Trotsky's views. Today, the CPB, largely following in the footsteps of Trotsky and Gonzalo, claims that various people's wars will fuse together and be transformed into World People's War. The belief that complex and varied contradictions can all be solved with warfare is a running theme in the PCP's and CPB's documents. As we will see below, their views on socialism being a militarized society and related musing on war communism are also deeply Trotskyist. Before moving on, let us circle back to one last part of the PCP's first reason for militarizing the party. They state,
We see how reaction is militarizing itself more and more, militarizing the old states, their economies, developing wars of aggression, trafficking with the struggles of the peoples and aiming toward a world war. But since revolution is the principal tendency in the world, emphasis ours, the task of the communist parties is to uphold revolution, shaping the principal form of struggle. People's war to oppose the world counter-revolutionary war with world revolutionary war.
However, it does not follow that because the reactionary forces of the world are increasing their military expenditure, that communist parties must, in turn, militarize. Historically, communist parties fought huge reactionary militaries without militarizing themselves. The CCP fought very powerful forces, the Japanese fascists, the nationalists, and the U.S. military in Korea. The Bolsheviks faced a joint invasion of numerous imperialist powers in the wake of WWE. Neither party was militarized. They did not militarize because they understood that the party must command the gun, and that becoming a military organization would jeopardize this, as well as weaken the party's ability to handle various contradictions correctly, i.e., with non-military means. The ruling class needs to be overthrown by force. However, if the party transforms into a military organization and makes its principal form of activity military-type actions, then it will not be able to carry out the complex and multifaceted tasks necessary to lead a successful revolution. What's more, as the recent defeat of the U.S. forces in Afghanistan shows, the massive expansion of military expenditure on the part of the imperialists does not necessarily correlate to their combat capabilities. In fact, increased spending can produce a form of decadence and create favorable conditions for revolution. Because huge portions of state budgets being spent on the military often leads to serious disinvestment elsewhere. And even when the reactionary forces are exceedingly well armed and trained, this does not in any way imply that the primary form of a party's activity must be military-type actions. The PCP's view that parties need to militarize because of increased military expenditure by reactionary forces is based on exceedingly mechanical views and clarifies nothing except that they understood neither the contradictory nature of the present reality nor the lessons of past revolutions. In short, they were revising the lessons of history and Marxism to justify militarizing the party. Political line, violence under socialism, and the PCP's one-size-fits-all approach. According to the PCP, militarization of the party isn't just needed to successfully overthrow the bourgeoisie of any and all countries. They also see a militarized party as the key for the whole socialist period, until communism. Indeed, as we will discuss later, they see socialist society itself as a militarized society. On this question, they once again fundamentally revise the lessons and basic principles of MLM. So why is a militarized party key for socialism according to the PCP? Let's now examine the second point used to justify militarizing communist parties.
Second, because capitalist restoration must be prevented. When the bourgeoisie loses power, it introduces itself inside the party, uses the army, and seeks to usurp power and destroy the dictatorship of the proletariat to restore capitalism. Therefore, the communist parties must militarize themselves and exercise the all-round dictatorship of the three instruments, forging themselves in people's war, and empower the armed organization of the masses, the people's militia, so as to engulf the army. For this reason, Chairman Gonzalo tells us to forge all militants as communists, first and foremost as fighters and as administrators. For that reason, every militant is forged in the people's war and remains alert against any attempt at capitalist restoration.
Here, the PCP incorrectly frames preventing the restoration of capitalism as principally a matter of military combat against the old defeated bourgeoisie, which, according to the PCP, infiltrates the party and the army to become the red bourgeoisie. This is a basic distortion of Marxism and the lessons of the GPCR. This is a fundamentally incorrect understanding of the basic class contradictions under socialism. It is not the case that the old bourgeoisie introduces itself inside the party, but rather that a new bourgeoisie arises within the party itself. Confusion on this topic reflects the PCP's lack of serious study of class struggle under socialism and represents a step backwards compared to the relative clarity expressed on this topic in some of their earlier documents in the 1960s and 70s. In fact, in the entirety of the general political line, the PCP put forward no real analysis of the successes and mistakes of the GPCR, just an idea that more military actions and a greater awareness of the threat of capitalist restoration will prevent future restorations. While there was some confusion in China at the end of GPCR about the imminent dangers of capitalist restoration, the fact that Hua Guofeng and Deng Xiaoping were able to mobilize a significant section of the masses against the Four by framing this campaign as opposing the bourgeois reactionary life of the Gang of Four shows that the Chinese people were overall not unaware of the threat of capitalist restoration, but that many of the masses were confused on how to identify capitalist roaders. In fact, millions of members of the masses were part of people's militias in China at this time. However, many were effectively neutralized because of this confusion on how to identify capitalist roaders, not because of a lack of guns or awareness of the threat of capitalist restoration. The people's militias are an essential element in guarding against capitalist restoration, but they are a form of mass organization, not a part of the militarized party model which the Gonzalists promote. Their approach, built around unconditional subjection to leadership, cannot but lead to more centralized military control, which is one of the most parts of the socialist state most vulnerable to becoming a counter-revolutionary headquarters. What's more, it is absurd to argue that the militarization of the party could have prevented the restoration of capitalism. The PCP does not deal with any of the concrete reasons for the defeat in China. It was not principally military matters which decided the victory of the bourgeois line in the GPCR, but rather the overall balance of forces in the class struggle and various errors in the political line of the left in the party. The GPCR was not a military struggle until the coup in 1976. Even then, the left had been working hard to prepare for such a coup and had extensive military forces at their disposal, but they had made key political, not principally military, mistakes, especially difficulties in uniting the middle section of the party to oppose the right, and therefore were vulnerable and somewhat isolated at the end of the GPCR. Mao was aware of some of these mistakes and had tried to warn the Four against making them. The recently translated documents from the late GPCR, which we wrote about in the second issue of Red Pages, provide some great clarity on these matters as well. It was simply not the case that the right had superior military forces, and that this factor was the key link that won the day, but rather that the left was not able to unite all who could be united to prevent the right from launching a coup, and therefore the right had superior military forces at their command at the decisive moment. At the risk of being repetitive, it is important to reiterate that the military weakness of the left at the time of the coup was a result of issues in their political line, and not the other way around. This is because, as Mao put it, political line decides everything, including the military forces the party has at its disposal. A party's political line is not reducible to abstract principles, but is a concrete thing based on the situation's specific understanding of how they advance the proletarian cause. It is the political line which determines the strength of the proletarian forces, including under socialism. The PCP's prattling about militarization of the party under socialism, and their ignorance of the fact that a new bourgeoisie arises within the party during this period, is tied to the fact that the PCP never dealt with the question of class struggle under socialism in a systematic way. They did not have a clear understanding of restricting bourgeois right under socialism. They did not grasp how it was that a new bourgeoisie could arise within the party itself. And perhaps most importantly, they did not grasp how putting the party under a system of military discipline would reinforce bourgeois relations in its ranks and contradict the principles of democratic centralism. They not only remained blind to this process unfolding in their own ranks, but actually advocated that this mistaken approach should be adopted by all other parties. But the passage quoted above does not just negate the basic lessons of the GPCR, Nor is it simply yet another demonstration of the PCP's basic lack of familiarity with the history of capitalist restoration in China. In reality, it expresses, in the most concise and concentrated form, the PCP's supposed solution to counter-revolution under socialism. Therefore, it is important to examine in great detail their views on this topic, as they provide insight into the PCP's understanding of the nature of class struggle under socialism and how this relates to the militarization of the party. As we have discussed earlier, for the PCP, militarization of party means the party is primarily carrying out military-type actions. They say that there are 4 types of such action, which are guerrilla actions, sabotages, selective annihilation, propaganda, and armed agitation. Putting aside for a moment the senselessness of saying that the primary activity of the party should always be to carry out military action, it does at least make sense for a party to carry out some of these types of actions during protracted People's War. But clearly, although perhaps not to the PCP and their contemporary disciples, sabotage, guerrilla actions, and selective annihilation of class enemies are generally not necessary under socialism, and decisions by people's courts to execute some counter-revolutionaries are not the same as selective annihilations. One could argue that various forms of action by a people's army under socialism amount to forms of armed propaganda. But this is not new or different than anything that was done in China and the USSR during the socialist period, e.g., military parades, the army helping train militias, etc. So, what sort of concrete military actions is the PCP proposing to maintain the militarization of the party under socialism? And how will these supposedly prevent the restoration of capitalism? Earlier in the document, the PCP spelled out their views on the matter.
Democratic revolutions are carried out with revolutionary violence. Socialist revolutions are carried out with revolutionary violence, and, in the face of restorations, we shall recover power through revolutionary violence. We shall maintain the continuation of the revolution under the dictatorship of the proletariat, with revolutionary violence through cultural revolutions, and we will only reach communism through revolutionary violence. As long as there is a place on earth in which exploitation exists, we shall finish it off through revolutionary violence.
And
cultural revolutions, which are made to continue the revolution under the dictatorship of the proletariat. The latter is to subject and eliminate any regeneration of capitalism and to wage armed combat against attempts at capitalist restoration, and which also serves to strengthen the dictatorship of the proletariat and the march towards communism.
from these quotes, it is clear that the PCP sees armed combat and revolutionary violence as central to the class struggle under socialism. And so, given that they repeatedly emphasize that the militarization of the party can only be carried forward through concrete military-type actions, it is clear that they view these forms of struggle as the key link under socialism. They view armed actions as the way to prevent capitalist restoration, and they view revolutionary violence as the main means by which to carry out the socialist revolution in Peru after the new democratic revolution, and the cultural revolutions under socialism. This is a direct departure from the lessons of the GPCR. First, there are different types of contradictions in the socialist period, and these must be handled through various methods. The existence of exploitation cannot be eliminated through violence alone. For example, the rich and even middle peasants engage in some form of exploitation. But this contradiction is not handled through violence, but through discussion, debate, land redistribution, and the development of socialist agriculture. This is because this is a contradiction among the people, despite the existence of some forms of exploitation of the poor peasants and agricultural laborers by other sections of the peasantry. And while these struggles happen in the larger context of the new democratic revolution and the socialist revolution, they are not forms of revolutionary violence. In short, We find here that the PCP is revising Maoism yet again. It is not even true that revolutionary violence is the only means to eliminate all forms of capitalist exploitation. This is a fact that was proven in the Russian and Chinese revolutions through practice. Although the violent expropriation of the bourgeoisie and control of large industries was central to the revolutions in Russia and China, a policy of buying out was used in the case of some small and medium capitalists. In fact, in his text, Left-Wing Childishness and the Petty Bourgeois Mentality, Lenin drew on Marx and emphasized the possibility, in certain conditions, to engage in a specific type of buying out, which the workers must offer to the most cultured, the most skilled, the most capable organizers among the capitalists who are ready to enter the service of Soviet power and to help honestly in organizing state production on the largest possible scale. This was the basic policy adopted by the Bolsheviks, with significant success. Likewise, in the Shanghai textbook, this point was emphasized and elaborated in detail.
After the proletariat seizes political power, confiscates big capital, and establishes a socialist economic foundation, it is possible to gradually subject medium and small capital to socialist transformation through the policy of buying out this capital and to transform the capitalist system ownership of the means of production into a socialist system of ownership by the whole people. The class nature of medium and small capital is the same as that of big capital. They are all enmeshed in the capitalist exploitation of the laboring people. They have interests contrary to those of the laboring masses and are the objects of socialist revolution. However, there are some differences between them. While medium and small capital often have the strong desire to develop capitalism, they can, at the same time, also be compelled into accepting compensation for their assets by the proletariat under certain conditions. Marxism believes that under certain conditions, the workers would certainly not refuse to buy out the bourgeoisie. Once the proletariat has seized political power and secured control over the lifeblood of the national economy, it will be advantageous to the proletariat if these capitalists can be compelled to accept a policy of being bought out by the proletariat and transform their capitalist enterprises into socialist enterprises.
The subtle and nuanced proletarian understanding of how to handle the socialist revolution expressed in this text stands in sharp contrast to the PCP's prattling about the centrality of violence as the highest form of resolving contradictions. From all of this, we can see that violence is not, at all times, the key link to eliminating exploitation. Revolutionary violence is needed to overthrow the ruling class, to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat, or the people's joint democratic dictatorship, to seize many of the means of production, especially large-scale industry, and to repel attempts at external invasion or internal sabotage. It is necessary to conquer political power. However, this revolutionary violence only lays the foundation for the elimination of exploitation. This is because various vestiges of exploitation and inequality linger after the overthrow of the ruling class. The Chinese communists allowed the national bourgeoisie to continue exploitation during the new democratic period, and the elimination of that exploitation was mainly carried out via buyouts, along with other measures which did not involve violence. To assert that violence is the key link here reflects the PCP's failure to grasp the lessons of MLM learned through the experiences of the Russian and Chinese revolutions. This confusion is tied to their listen-up approach to politics and related fantasies of having absolute militarized leadership over the United Front, in which all mass work is done by the army and other military organizations. This approach negates the basis for patriotic members of exploiting classes to support and be partners in the new democratic revolution. At the risk of being redundant, it must be emphasized again that for different contradictions, and different contradictions exist even with exploitation, different methods of resolving them are needed. This is true not only in the elimination of exploitation in the course of the socialist revolution, but also in the various cultural revolutions needed under socialism. Instead of a patient and clear historical analysis, the PCP promotes cut-and-dried solutions, principally the call for more violence. Their contemporary adherents double down on this trend, for example, with their slogans of "People's War Until Communism." As we mentioned above, throughout the GPCR, there was an effort by both the right and the ultra-left forces in the party to turn the struggle into a civil war and/or military conflict. In contrast to this, as we noted above, the general slogan promoted by the left during the GPCR was to use reason, not violence. When Jiang Qing promoted the idea that the rebel masses should attack with words, defend with weapons, she was criticized by Mao and others for this articulation, which was used by various factional and ultra-left forces to justify their efforts to transform the GPCR into a military conflict. Mao and other leaders in the left criticized various Red Guard groups who pushed things in this direction as well. The focus on revolutionary violence and the related idea of militarizing the party as the key way to prevent capitalist restoration fails to grasp the contradiction in a cultural revolution between the principal task and the goal. In a typical petty bourgeois fashion, the PCP equates the question of preventing capitalist restoration with suppressing and eliminating class enemies with violence. In doing so, they not only fail to grapple with the need to mobilize the masses to struggle, not principally in a military fashion, against the capitalist roaders, but also fail to understand the class relations under socialism, which inevitably give rise to a new bourgeoisie within the party itself. Given this ignorance, they cannot grasp how the struggle of the masses in various fields to restrict bourgeois right and break with old ideas is central to eliminating the basis for revisionism. Contrary to the PCP's assertions, the inner-party bourgeoisie is not a secret faction of rightists who sneak into the party. Rather, it develops as a result of the class contradictions under socialism, with rightists primarily generated from within the party rather than sneaking into it. Mao emphasized that without a dialectical view on these matters, it was easy to misunderstand the aims of the GPCR.
To struggle against power holders who take the capitalist road is the main task, but it is by no means the goal. The goal is to solve the problem of world outlook. It is the question of eradicating the roots of revisionism. If the world outlook is not transformed, how can the great proletarian cultural revolution be called a victory? If the world outlook is not transformed, then although there are 2,000 power holders taking the capitalist road in this great cultural revolution, there may be 4,000 next time.
From this, it should be clear that, once again, the PCP's basic approach on a fundamental question of Maoism, namely, the goals and methods of cultural revolutions under socialism, is a direct departure from and revision of the practices advocated by Mao. By promoting militarization of the party and revolutionary violence as the solutions to preventing capitalist restoration in socialist society, they make it clear that they see the class struggle under socialism as principally a thing to be overseen via military and administrative means devoid of mass initiative. This is a view of socialism that does not acknowledge the revolutionary breakthrough achieved during the GPCR, or the key verdicts on the question of the inner-party bourgeoisie advanced by Mao during this time. The PCP puts forward no clear analysis of how to grasp revolution and promote production. Nothing about how to overcome the contradictions among the people, and remains silent on how to overcome various backwards ideas that the masses have internalized. They reject the need to methodically and patiently overcome the four alls via various forms of struggle, a striking abandonment of Marxism. As we can see, not only is the militarization of the party not justified by the danger of capitalist restoration, as it is no solution to the problem. But the PCP's views on socialism and cultural revolutions are fundamentally at odds with the basic lessons of MLM. Trotskyism, war communism, and the militarization of society. This brings us to the third and final argument the PCP advances for why communist parties must militarize.
Third, because we march toward a militarized society. By militarizing the party, we complete a step toward the militarization of society, which is the strategic perspective to guarantee the dictatorship of the proletariat. The militarized society is the sea of armed masses which Marx and Engels spoke of, that guards the conquest of power and defends it once conquered. We take the experience of the Chinese Revolution, of the anti-Japanese base at Yan'an, which was a militarized society where everything grew out of the barrels of guns, emphasis ours. Party, army, state, new politics, new economics, new culture. And in that way, we develop war communism.
This point is just as muddled as the previous two. Under socialist society, it's true that the masses will be highly armed. But this does not make it a militarized society, so to speak. People having arms and being organized into militias does not mean that they are militarized. The PCP and contemporary Gonzaloitas, like the CPB, have repeatedly emphasized that militarizing the party does not just mean fighting a people's war or arming the party. Instead, they emphasize that militarization of the party means that the principal form of activity of the party is military-type actions. So the militarization of society should be understood along similar lines, unless they are completely eclectic and words mean nothing to them. And, to the PCP's credit, they are remarkably consistent on this topic. So it is clear that when they speak of war as the highest form of resolving contradictions and socialism as a militarized society in which everything grows out of the barrel of guns, they mean that under socialism, the principal form of activity of the people should be military-type actions, and organization of socialist society is principally military. In this regard, the PCP's reference to war communism, a specific policy pursued during the Russian Civil War by the Bolsheviks with a misleading name, is quite telling. Actually, their promotion of war communism as a goal and their related views on socialism being a militarized society are largely in line with the policies promoted by Trotsky at the end of the Russian Civil War. Lenin argued that Trotsky's policies were a political mistake, which, if not corrected, would lead to the collapse of the dictatorship of the proletariat. During the Russian Civil War, the Bolsheviks were in a very dire situation. Attacked by numerous imperialist powers, as well as the forces of domestic reaction, with the economy in ruin and famine and disease rampaging throughout the country, they were forced to adopt extraordinary and exceptional measures to ensure victory in the Civil War. To illustrate the difficulties they faced, it is helpful to elaborate on the circumstances at the time. In 1918, many peasants began to keep for themselves large portions of their grain surplus, which was needed at the front for the war effort and to feed the cities. Large-scale absenteeism was developing in industry, and workers in some industries were selling off stocks of goods and spare parts on their own in the black market so that they could afford basic goods, which were rapidly rising in price. These actions amounted to rampant individualism which, if left unchecked, would doom the dictatorship of the proletariat. While the party was able to promote some forms of communist spirit and political discipline among the advanced section of the working class and some of the peasantry, for example, with the communist Subotniks, they were not able to do this on a broad enough scale to prevent many of these issues. Therefore, in a situation where the political consciousness of the masses was not sufficiently developed, the Bolsheviks were backed into a corner and forced to use a form of administrative centralization and discipline to ensure that the economy did not collapse and that the Civil War was won. In short, they had to use state power to coerce a section of the peasantry and working class into maintaining the economy so that the war effort could proceed. Lenin and the Central Committee repeatedly emphasized that these measures were temporary and only adopted because of the extremely dire situation in which the party found itself. In the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolshevik, Stalin spells out some of the measures that were taken in this period.
The Soviet government introduced war communism. It took under its control the middle-sized and small industries, in addition to large-scale industry, so as to accumulate goods for the supply of the army and the agricultural population. It introduced a state monopoly of the grain trade, prohibited private trading in grain, and established the surplus appropriation system, under which all surplus produce in the hands of the peasants was to be registered and acquired by the state at fixed prices, so as to accumulate stores of grain for the provisioning of the army and the workers. Lastly, it introduced universal labor service for all classes.
In addition, a system of militarization of labor was introduced. This included a system of coercion and labor discipline, where workers would be sent to penal labor camps for labor desertion and shirking. It also entailed the organization of all workers into labor units, which were run with the same strictness as was and is being shown towards officers in relation to the Army's needs. Likewise, the party adopted policies of requisitioning grain from the peasantry, e.g., non-voluntary collections of surplus grain, at times even without proper compensation, and a governmentalizing of the trade unions, which significantly limited the internal democracy of these mass organizations and placed them under the direct administrative control of the Narkomtrud, the Commissariat for Labor. These measures were necessary, given the exceedingly difficult situation faced by the party and the people as a result of the civil war and famine, as well as the lack of discipline and proletarian class consciousness among a significant section of the workers and peasantry. However, these policies, given their necessary reliance on the administrative and bureaucratic methods, sharpened various class contradictions at the time. For example, state departments like Glavpolitput, the chief political department of the People's Commissariat for Communication, which worked to rehabilitate the railways, and Sektran, the Central Committee of the Joint Trade Union of Rail and Water Transport Workers, placed under state control, were given extraordinary powers during this period. These powers, on the one hand, enabled them to rehabilitate the railroads and the economy, but on the other hand, bred various bureaucratic, undemocratic, and bourgeois administrative practices which caused the state organs and governmentalized trade unions to start to lose touch with the masses. Similar dynamics arose with the requisitioning of all surplus grain from the peasantry. Lenin summed up the successes and failures of the war communism period with a number of insightful remarks. First, he noted that the policy was forced on them by the circumstances, but that it was, in the main, a correct policy, despite various mistakes and excesses.
The harmonious system that has been created was dictated by war and not by economic requirements, considerations, or conditions. There was no other way out in the conditions of the unexampled ruin in which we found ourselves, when after a big war, we were obliged to endure a number of civil wars. We must state quite definitely that in pursuing our policy, we may have made mistakes and gone to extremes in a number of cases. But in the wartime conditions then prevailing, the policy was in the main a correct one. We had no alternative but to resort to wholesale and instant monopoly, including the confiscation of all surplus stocks, even without compensation. That was not a harmonious economic system. It was not a measure called forth by economic conditions, but one largely dictated to us by war conditions.
He also noted that, despite it being a necessary and largely correct policy in a time of civil war communism was not a policy capable of transforming the relations of production from the old society into socialist relations of production, and thus unleashing a corresponding development of the productive forces.
It was the war and the ruin that forced us into war communism. It was not, and could not be, a policy that corresponded to the economic tasks of the proletariat. It was a makeshift. The correct policy of the proletariat, exercising its dictatorship in a small peasant country, is to obtain grain in exchange for the manufactured goods the peasant needs. That is the only kind of food policy that corresponds to the tasks of the proletariat and can strengthen the foundations of socialism and lead to its complete victory.
All of this should make it clear that it is extremely strange that the PCP promotes the idea that socialism is a militarized society, one in which everything grows out of the barrel of the gun, and claims that, in that way, we develop war communism. As the above quotes show, war communism was a temporary measure, one which Lenin described as makeshift, and which he noted could not be a policy that corresponded to the economic tasks of the proletariat. The PCP disagrees with Lenin's analysis of this period, and instead sees it as a model for socialism, a militarized society with labor organized along military lines, and with a militarized party which, in order to carry forward its militarization, principally performs military-type actions. Military, military, military. What a mess this all is. What a garbled distortion of the lessons of MLM. All of it justified by the supposedly new circumstance of the class struggle, and the idea that this will prevent capitalist restoration. What typical petty bourgeois impetuosity and infatuation with violence. What the PCP reveals here is that their supposed new synthesis of MLM is based either on a profound lack of knowledge of the basic writings of Marx, Lenin, and Mao, and a related basic lack of familiarity with the lessons of the Russian and Chinese revolutions, or a profound and conscious distortion of these lessons to elevate Gonzalo as the supposed fourth sword of Marxism, after Marx, Lenin, and Mao. In fact, what Gonzalo and the PCP put forward about socialism, with their talk of war communism and a militarized society, is nothing new, but is largely a rehashing of the position put forward by Trotsky at the end of the Russian Civil War, the very position which Lenin noted risked destroying the dictatorship of the proletariat. Let's examine this more closely. As the Russian Civil War was drawing to a close, the Bolshevik Party was preparing to enter into a new phase of the revolution. In the extremely difficult years of the Civil War, they had only been able to take some provisional steps to overcome capitalist and pre-capitalist relations of production and social relations. But having largely defeated the counter-revolution and foreign invasion by late 1920, a series of questions confronted the Bolsheviks. In effect, they were at a crossroads. They could continue the revolutionary transformation of society or preserve in various forms the existing capitalist and pre-capitalist social relations and relations of production. Part of this question pertained to the methods used during war communism, which tended to strengthen bureaucratic and bourgeois tendencies in the state organs, especially those in charge of various sectors of production, and in the party as well. It was in this context that the party crisis arose, with Lenin and Stalin on one side and Trotsky and Bukharin on the other. In late 1920, the Bolshevik Party concluded that there was a need to move away from the policies of war communism, to evaluate the successes and failures of these experiences, and to focus on the key tasks at hand of developing socialist relations of production. Trotsky and Bukharin, however, were unsatisfied with this approach. Earlier in the year, their line had been defeated at the Nine-Party Congress. There, Trotsky and Bukharin had advocated that the militarization of labor and the trade unions and the related system of one-man management was required for the entire period of transition from capitalism to socialism and beyond. This was justified by a form of productive forces determinism. For example, in a pamphlet prepared for the Congress, Trotsky advocated planned, systematic, persistent, and stern struggle be waged against desertion from labor, in particular by the publication of black lists of labor deserters, the formation of penal battalions made up of these deserters, and finally, their confinement in concentration camps. At the Congress itself, Trotsky put forward his theses on the need for a militarization of labor. First, he insisted that
the mass of the workers must be bound to their jobs, made liable to transfer, told what to do, ordered about.
He also insisted that
before it disappears, state compulsion will, in the period of transition, reach its highest degree of intensity in the organization of labor.
He explained all of this in terms of the need to militarize the working class throughout the whole period of transition from capitalism to socialism.
Militarization of labor is unthinkable without the militarization of the trade unions as such, without the establishment of a regime in which every worker feels himself a soldier of labor who cannot dispose of himself freely. If the order is given to transfer him, he must carry it out. If he does not carry it out, he will be a deserter who is punished. Who looks after this? The trade union. It creates the new regime. This is the militarization of the working class.
Trotsky's position, largely in line with the PCP's emphasis on socialism as a militarized society, is that trade unions and other mass organizations should be subordinated to the party and the state under a form of military control. This is in line with the Gonzaloist view of the concentric circles of party building and the need for absolute leadership by the Party of the United Front, and therefore the trade unions, which are mass organizations within the United Front. This, in effect, reduces the role of trade unions to enforcing military discipline in production, a form of extreme administrative centralization which chokes mass initiative. Trotsky's views were rejected at the Ninth Congress, and the temporary and exceptional nature of the measures adopted during the period of war communism was reasserted. This was Lenin and Stalin's line, which won out over Trotsky and Bukharin. However, in late 1920, when the party began to move away from many of the temporary measures of war communism, Trotsky and Bukharin kicked up a storm, creating what Lenin referred to as the party crisis. On November 3rd, at the 5th All-Russia Trade Union Conference, Trotsky argued that the party had to tighten the screws of war communism and advocated a shake-up of the trade unions, namely removing from above any trade union leaders who disagreed with the continued militarization of labor and methods of coercion, or who criticized the bureaucratic tendencies then developing in a section of the party and state machinery. Lenin, criticizing Trotsky, noted that the disagreement was about a fundamentally
different approach to the mass, the way of winning it over and keeping in touch with it.
In short, Trotsky's approach, which was again defeated at the 10-Party Congress, advocated a fundamentally different relationship between the party and the masses than did Lenin's. Lenin opposed the militarization of society and the trade unions. He argued that a trade union
is not a state organization, nor is it one designed for coercion, but for education.
What's more, he warned that Trotsky's approach, including his insistence of the absolute leadership of the party over the trade unions and the party's related ability to
shake up the leadership of the unions at any time, would lead to the collapse of the dictatorship of the proletariat.
This mistake, common to both Trotsky and Bukharin's platforms at the time, was reproduced by the PCP and is also promoted by Gonzaletas today. Common to these erroneous positions is an assumption that the proletarian character of the party is guaranteed, and thus, quite naturally, the party's absolute authority over the United Front, mass organizations, and the masses broadly guarantees the victory of the revolution and socialism. This is clearly a revision of the basic lessons of Leninism, which were clarified in stark terms in this struggle against Trotsky and Bukharin. Lenin's line ultimately won the day, and the Central Committee published a statement condemning
the degeneration of centralization and the militarizing of labor into bureaucracy, arrogance, petty functionarism, and pestering interference in the trade unions.
The CC also reaffirmed the need to move away from the militarization of labor and the other measures of war communism, as the Civil War had largely been won by that point, and these measures had given rise to a series of new problems. Lenin also noted that trade unions and other mass organizations were essential under socialism, and had to have sufficient independence from the party and the state, so that they could protect the masses from various bureaucratic and bourgeois tendencies that arose in socialist society. He highlighted that this independence would, in turn, help protect the DOP.
We, for our part, must use these workers' organizations to protect the workers from their state and to get them to protect our state.
From all this, it is clear that the PCP's line on socialism is, in fact, deeply revisionist. In fact, by promoting the idea of socialism as a militarized society and claiming that the goal is to develop war communism, the PCP and its contemporary adherents are discarding Lenin and instead taking up Trotsky and Bukharin. This is revisionism through and through. It demonstrates a profound lack of historical knowledge, deep-seated bourgeois ideas of leadership, a fundamental difference with MLM in how the party should relate to the masses under socialism, and a typically petty bourgeois infatuation with violence and militarism. In short, a stinking heap of revisionist garbage. But again for the PCP, and especially for contemporary Gonzaloists, historical details and the immensely important lessons of the ICM are too much to bother with. When one gleefully proclaims that warfare is the highest form of resolving contradictions, what else is needed? The lessons of the class struggle are reduced to trivial details in their millenarian fantasies. Conclusion. The PCP fundamentally revised key lessons of MLM. In instances detailed above, rather than integrating the key lessons of Mao and the GPCR, they oriented towards Lin Biao's analysis. In other cases, they put forward Dühring-like views of an all-knowing genius. On questions of socialism and an evaluation of war communism, they discarded Lenin and took up Trotsky's position. At the same time, despite their shortcomings, their achievements must be recognized. They initiated a people's war, maintained that the dictatorship of the proletariat is the prerequisite for the liberation of the masses, and that this must be achieved by violent revolution. In contrast to the grandiose claims that Gonzalo synthesized defined Maoism, the truth is that when it comes to Gonzalo's theoretical contributions, what is good is not new, and what is new is not good. While the PCP led the revolutionary movement in Peru, their leadership ultimately was unable to work out a correct line to guide the movement and squandered a revolutionary situation in Peru, eventually adopting a left deviationist line. This was not inevitable. The PCP, despite some initial mistakes, could have corrected various errors and summed up their successes and failures in a dialectical materialist manner. They did not do this. Instead, they enshrined numerous mistaken ideas and wrong tendencies as the foundation of their politics in their general political line, and insisted these mistaken ideas had universal validity. The consequences of this no doubt contributed to the defeat of the revolution in Peru, which unfortunately has still not been able to regroup, even after 3 decades. Now, various Gonzalite groups have created their new international organization. They are promoting various revisionist theories inspired by Gonzalo and the PCP and calling this MMLM. There has been a dearth of struggle in the ICM over the question of Gonzalo and the PCP's theoretical views and their contribution to Maoist theory. Our hope is that this document can spark some further debate and necessary struggle. We also hope that comrades can point out and elaborate on our shortcomings and mistakes in this analysis.